Good morning. We are meeting today to consider the nomination of Mr. Wilbur Ross to be the next Secretary of Commerce. If confirmed, Mr. Ross would bring decades of business, entrepreneurial, and civic experience to this important position. Mr. Ross is perhaps best known for his expertise in revitalizing distressed businesses such as those in the United States steel industry. At a time when most inventors had abandoned the industry, investors, I should say, had abandoned the industry, he organized International Steel Group in 2002, and through acquisitions made it the largest integrated steel company in North America. Later, it merged with Mittal Steel to form the largest steel company in the world. Mr. Ross's strong record of achievement in business led Bloomberg Businessweek to name him one of the 50 most influential people in global finance in 2011. It's also why he is the only person elected to both the Turnaround Management Hall of Fame and the Private Equity Hall of Fame. Mr. Ross's business experience is complemented by his service to the community. Mr. Ross served as a first lieutenant in the U.S. Army, and he is currently a member of the Dean's Advisory Board of Harvard Business School. He's also an advisory board member of the Yale University School of Management, which has presented him with its Legend of Leadership Award. Mr. Ross's nomination comes at an important time in our nation's economic recovery, and I believe his extensive management experience in the private sector and his understanding of the challenges faced by workers and businesses alike will equip him well for the job of leading the Department of Commerce. This large department, which has 12 different bureaus and nearly 47,000 employees located in all 50 states and around the world, oversees a diverse array of issues, from trade to fishery management and from weather forecasting to the Census Bureau. I'll be asking Mr. Ross about many of the challenges facing the department and our economy. First and foremost, I'll be asking how he plans to deal with trade matters as the Secretary of Commerce. I also want to explore how, if confirmed, he would continue to play a lead role in advocating for policies that promote American innovation, like freeing up government spectrum for private use and facilitating the growing Internet of Things. Mr. Ross's experience turning around businesses should help him anticipate and mitigate the risks of major programs like FirstNet, the independent authority charged with creating a nationwide broadband network for first responders, and the acquisition of critical weather satellites by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Finally, I would note that collaboration between the public and private sectors is one of the hallmarks of the Department's work, as exemplified by the ongoing development of cybersecurity best practices and standards, which this committee has strongly endorsed. Mr. Ross, should you be confirmed, we will be depending on you to continue this collaboration and strengthen it where necessary. Mr. Ross, I believe your business know-how and intelligence make you an excellent candidate to serve as the next Secretary of Commerce, and I look forward to supporting your nomination. I want to turn now to our ranking member, the distinguished senator from Florida, Senator Nelson, for any opening remarks that he'd like to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wilbur Ross and Hillary Ross, we welcome you both to the committee. I want to congratulate you on your nomination. You and, interestingly, the incumbent, Secretary Pritzker, have some of the most extensive financial holdings of any nominees before this committee. After reviewing your financial disclosure and ethics agreement, it's my understanding that you have agreed to divest the vast majority of your personal holdings and resign from nearly 50 boards and organizations. I believe that's the right thing to do, and it tells me that you are committed to doing the job the right way by placing the public's interest ahead of your own. It's my hope that President Trump will follow your lead and the example that you set to eliminate any business dealings that could pose potential conflicts of interest. Now, in recent years, the Commerce Secretary post has not been one of the most sought or one of the most appreciated positions in Washington. But I have a feeling that that's about to change in a big way. As the President-elect has indicated, he is going to look to you to help lead the administration's trade agenda. That's a departure from past Commerce Secretaries and the role that they played which was much smaller in setting U.S. trade policy. Given that expanded role and the incoming president's desire to make job creation and overhauling trade deals top priorities, I hope that we'll hear from you today, as the chairman has already indicated, on the administration's trade plans and how you all will hope to create jobs that will benefit all Americans. I'd like for you to tell us more about how your trade duties might expand and how this could impact the role of the U.S. Trade Representative, who traditionally has taken the lead on the trade negotiations. And while we're on the topic of protecting American workers, there's been some negative commentary on how you built your business empire by buying and selling troubled companies. Others have lauded you for saving companies and thousands of jobs. I think it would be most helpful to all of us on the committee if we could get an assessment from you on your record of job creation and what the lessons that you've learned that will help grow and protect American workers. Now, while I expect a good portion of today will be spent talking about trade and jobs and your experience, there's a lot more to the Department of Commerce. This department of some 40,000 employees impacts our daily lives by a number of things. Providing vital weather forecasts to millions of Americans through NOAA and the National Weather Service. Playing a huge role in building out our nation's digital infrastructure. Helping grow and expand minority-owned businesses. Collecting all sorts of data, including data critical to jobs and the economy, as well as monitoring environmental conditions and climate change. And that brings me to one of my last topics, and one more that is especially important to Mr. Ross, your state of Florida. That is sea level rise and global warming. Florida has over 20 million people, and 75% of them live on the coast, including the two of you. The state's highest point is only 345 feet. That, by the way, a piece of trivia, in the peninsula state is a position in the middle of the state where Bok Tower at Lake Wales is located. Because of the work of NOAA and NASA and other agencies, we have measurements and forecasts that can tell us when a monster storm is coming. And we also have the science to know that coastal communities face peril even on sunny days because of the long-term atmospheric trends. Scientifically, accurate data from weather satellites shows that it is, in fact, happening. And the problem is that some folks will go to any length to deny this truth, including gagging climate scientists. Now, that shouldn't happen, and that should be troubling to us. So, given your personal experience of being a Floridian, I hope that you will agree on the need to continue vital scientific research to inform the public about extreme weather events and trends over time. And it's my hope that we'll get a commitment from you to not allow intimidation and censorship of climate scientists under your jurisdiction. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I see my colleague, my fellow Floridian, Senator Rubio. He has come back to the committee, and I know you're going to introduce him. I'm looking forward to having him formally introduce our nominee.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. We are very privileged to have Senator Rubio here, your colleague from Florida and our colleague in the United States Senate, to introduce Mr. Ross. And so I welcome back to the committee Senator Rubio, and please proceed with your remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I must say, the members, you guys look different from this side of the dais. But anyway, thank you. I appreciate the honor of being here, Mr. Chairman. I'm honored to be here to introduce Wilbur Ross, who's a fellow Floridian, and he is President-elect Trump's nominee for Secretary of Commerce. I also want to thank you and Senator Nelson for allowing me this honor, especially, as you said, I enjoyed serving on this committee for the past 6 years. So to say that Mr. Ross has extensive business experience and extensive experience working in the private sector, I believe, is quite an understatement. For more than half a century now, there is virtually no part of the American economy in which he has not created jobs. This includes industries such as airlines and apparel, auto parts, banking, beer, chemicals, credit cards, electric utilities, food service, furniture, home building, insurance, marine transport, mortgages, oil and gas, rail car manufacturing and leasing, real estate, restaurants, shipyards, steel, textiles, and trucking. In all, Mr. Ross has been chairman or lead director of more than 100 companies operating in more than 20 different countries. And he would bring this real-world experience to a department whose mission is fundamentally about expanding opportunity for American entrepreneurs and workers all over the world. Despite his professional commitments in the private sector, Mr. Ross has also devoted time to public service, answering the call from leaders in both parties. All in all, Mr. Ross will bring an important perspective to major policy debates we need to have. This includes modernizing our tax code, strengthening our economy, empowering entrepreneurs and small businesses, increasing wages for hardworking families, and ensuring a fair and competitive playing field when it comes to selling American products and services to the rest of the world. I am confident that Mr. Ross will serve this nation admirably, and I am proud to introduce him to the committee here today. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the ranking member.
Thank you, Senator Rubio. I want to ask Mr. Ross, please come forward and take the witness stand. We'll look forward to hearing directly from you. Let's see, we're surrounded by Floridians today, Mr. Senator Nelson, and I know that there are many of Senator Klobuchar's and my constituents who end up being part-time constituents of yours this time of the year in Florida.
And eventually they become full-timers. Mr. Chairman, we're looking forward to hosting you in Florida as you so graciously hosted me in South Dakota. So too, we're going to show you the amazing river of grass, the Everglades.
Thank you, and thank you for doing it in February. Mr. Ross, please proceed. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Nelson, and members of the committee. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to appear before you today. As a proud resident of Florida, I would also like to thank Senator Marco Rubio for his kind introduction. With me today is my wife, Hillary Geary Ross. Since President-elect Trump announced my nomination, I've had the opportunity to meet with many of you. In our meetings, I've heard firsthand how we can work together to the benefit of the American people. These meetings have been helpful to me, and I look forward to continuing the dialogue. I may be the only nominee ever for Commerce Secretary who actually worked as a census taker. When I was working my way through Harvard Business School, I was a census taker, what they more technically call an enumerator, in the Scully Square area of Boston. And that task was quite fascinating in that they had me wear a big white belt around diagonally from the shoulder to the waist, and then a big white one around the waist, and a big kind of school patrol badge. And Then we had to talk our way into people's households to get them to let us take the Senate. So I have firsthand expertise in that, and I can appreciate the enormity of the task for the 2020 decennial census. I've also been over the years a very large consumer of various forms of data put out by different departments of the Department of Commerce. Census data, BEA data, data from NOAA, all kinds of information have come out. And I believe it's the case that the Commerce Department emits 40% of all the data to the public that comes out of all of the departments combined. So that's a huge task. Getting it right, getting it timely is a big challenge and one that we will work a lot on. Another very, very important function, of course, is spectrum. We need more spectrum in the private sector, and I will try my best to help convince those government agencies that have spectrum and don't really need it to permit it to be commercialized. And that may very well be a help toward extending broadband to some of the more rural communities and other segments that are underserved right now. I have some firsthand experience there in that I have been vice chair of my community in southern Florida that's in the process of undergrounding its utilities to bring fiber optic service and 21st century service throughout the community, and also to protect us better against the exigencies of weather, which, as Senator Nelson and Senator Rubio pointed out, is a big threat in southern Florida. Weather sensitivity is something that comes to you naturally if you're in Florida. Hillary and I live right on the water there, and so we're well aware of the importance of timely warning of impending hurricanes. And I'm also aware that until NOAA has been launching its new series of satellites, there had been an inferiority of our weather forecasting relative to what was done in Europe and in Japan. As far as I can tell, the new sensing devices will more than bring us up to equal and probably ahead of the others. Southern Florida also is characterized by very great importance of fishing and tourism. And if there's one consistent message I got as I met with the various members of the committee, it's just how important fishing is. I didn't really understand quite how intricate an industry it is. I think I now have some fundamental grasp of it and its importance. One of the things I'd like to try to help correct is we, believe it or not, have a trade deficit in fishing of some $11 billion a year. Given the enormity of our coastlines, given the enormity of our fresh water, I would like to try to figure out how we can become much more self-sufficient in fishing and perhaps even a net exporter of fishing. As to trade, over the years, I've had businesses that actually operated in some 23 countries. For the most part, our businesses have been domestic, but we have been on the ground in all of the major trading partners of this country. As a result, we know directly both what's good and a lot of the things that are not so good about the trade policies of many of these other countries. I am not anti-trade. I am pro-trade, but I'm pro-sensible trade, not pro-trade that is to the disadvantage of the American worker and the American manufacturing community. I think we should provide access to our markets to those countries who play fair, play by the rules, and give everybody a fair chance to compete. Those who do not should not get away with it. They should be punished, and severely. I think that we cannot afford trade that is inherently bad for American workers and for American businesses. But I think there are plenty of opportunities to expand our exports. And I think the number one objective will be expanding our exports. I think that there are many things that we can do that we haven't been doing, and I look forward to discussing some of those as we get into more detailed questions. Very recently, the President-elect has convened meetings with various of the high-tech executives, and I've been impressed to learn from them how similar the problems they face with the protectionism in a variety of other countries to the problems that manufacturing businesses face. So while the exact implementation of the improper things is not the same, the general direction is the same, trying to thwart American progress. That's something we need to try to fix. There are many, many more functions that the Commerce Department has, but in the limited time of introductory remarks, I think I'll stop there and hopefully deal with the others during the question and answer period. So I thank you again for having me here today.
Thank you, Mr. Ross. And before we begin our questions, I want to ask unanimous consent to put multiple letters of support for Mr. Ross into the record, including those from 4 former Secretaries of Commerce from both parties endorsing him for the position. Without objection, is so ordered. Thank you. And we will now turn to questions. Mr. Ross, according to media accounts, should you be confirmed as Secretary of Commerce, President-elect Trump will formally tap you to oversee the nation's trade policy. And I'm wondering what you might be able specifically to describe in terms of what you'll be seeking to accomplish with regard to trade policy in the first 100 days of the Trump administration. And if you could home in a little bit, because of a lot of the media reporting, specifically with regard to China, and also there were some stories this morning regarding Canada and NAFTA. So if you could speak to those issues.
Surely, sir. We are well aware of the legislated powers of the U.S. Trade Representative, and obviously neither the President nor I is going to try to do anything that is adverse to the congressional mandate given to the U.S. Trade Rep. Having said that, though, we think it is good for trade policy to bring all of the intellectual resources that we can muster to That was not part of my prepared remarks.
Thank you. Please proceed.
I was saying I think it's important to bring all the intellectual resources and experience that we can to helping solve the trade issues. And therefore, I view that there will be a collaborative process among the U.S. Trade Rep, myself, and Peter Navarro, the White House Director of the National Trade Council. We will try our best collectively to do what's best for this country. So that's how we visualize the interaction of those parties working. As to Canada and Mexico, the President-elect has made no secret in his public remarks, nor have I in earlier remarks during the campaign, that NAFTA is logically the first thing for us to deal with. We ought to solidify relationships in the best way we can in our own territory before we go off to other jurisdictions. So I think that should be, and hopefully will be, if I'm confirmed, a very, very early topic in this administration.
And China?
Sorry?
China,
yes.
Yeah.
China is the most protectionist country of very large countries. They have both very high tariff barriers and very high non-tariff trade barriers to commerce. So they talk much more about free trade than they actually practice. We would like to levelize that playing field and bring the realities a bit closer to the rhetoric.
Mr. Ross, you co-authored President-elect Trump's American Infrastructure First Plan, which is described as featuring a major private sector revenue-neutral option to help finance a significant share of the nation's infrastructure needs. There's bipartisan interest in working together on infrastructure issues, but there are also questions about how the new administration's plan will address infrastructure projects that do not have a readily available revenue source, and that would apply to most rural projects. Could you provide some insights as to how the America's Infrastructure First Plan will address the infrastructure needs in rural America?
Surely. Well, first of all, as to the plan that we wrote about during the campaign, that concept of the public-private partnership with tax incentives for equity investment was simply meant to be yet another tool, because I think there are three categories of infrastructure projects. One are the ones that are simple to finance, where they have an inherent, well-documented, reliable source of revenue from user fees. Those don't really need much more help because they have access to the tax-exempt bond market and to the corporate debt market. The third category is the trickiest one, and some of the rural activities go in that. That's ones where it's very hard to find a convincing source of revenue. It seems to me those will have to be subsidized by someone as part of an overall infrastructure project. The one in the middle is the ones that have a potential revenue source, but it isn't as clearly defined that you can just do it without needing equity. So the purpose of the plan that we put forward, the public-private partnership, was to fill that second gap. So it's not in place of concepts like Build America bonds. It's not in place of conventional financing. It simply was meant to provide another tool. And the reason I think we need another tool is the infrastructure needs of this country are so monumental that we need any available source of capital in order to meet it on a timely basis.
Well, I would just simply say that there are a lot of members of this committee on both sides of the aisle that represent large geographic areas, and would look forward to working with you as you shape that plan to ensure that rural areas are not left out of the equation. My time's expired, but before we turn to other members for questions, I wanted to seek clarification from you, Mr. Ross, on one additional subject. Upon your nomination and as part of this confirmation process, it's my understanding that you determined that you had hired a household employee in 2009 who had presented a Social Security card in the employee's name along with a valid driver's license, but who recently was unable to provide similar documentation again. Once you made this discovery, I understand you immediately terminated that particular household employee and informed the committee. Prior to this discovery, however, you had used the Social Security number this person provided you to pay all applicable taxes for this household employee from 2009 to 2016 without incident. I want to say, Mr. Ross, thank you for being forthcoming with the committee about this particular matter, and would ask you if I've explained accurately the facts and if there's anything further that you'd like to add about this matter at this point.
Those are the facts, and we did the best that we thought we could do in order to verify the legality of the employment, and it turned out that was incorrect. So, but we did pay all of the withholdings, so did that employee, and so did all the other employees that we've had. What happened was when I was getting ready for this hearing, I wanted to recheck all of our present and former employees. They all produced the appropriate records again, and in many cases, they had now advanced to the point where they're actually citizens, so I'm very happy with that. This one employee was unable to, and therefore was terminated.
Thank you, Mr. Ross. Senator Nelson.
And I think it's important to point out that that wasn't just one or two employees. You had a battery of employees over those years.
Yes, Senator, that's correct, a dozen or so.
I have, of course, talked to the chairman about this. You were forthcoming in your questionnaire that you filled out for the committee. You were a private citizen all that period of time, and it was only until such time that you had been named Commerce Secretary that you then rechecked and then found out that one of your dozen or so employees had in fact deceived you. Is that correct?
Yes, it is, Senator.
And then you immediately dismissed that employee.
That is correct, sir.
And that all occurred sometime within the past month.
That is correct also.
Okay. Can you share with the committee what I stated in the opening statement about that you have bought and sold many businesses? You know what the critics have said. You know those who have said that you have been a job creator, praising your work. So could you share with us how you would characterize that part of your business, and does your record demonstrate that as Secretary of Commerce that you're going to be putting businesses first, and especially American workers first?
Thank you for that question, Senator. Some of the companies that we have been cited, International Steel Group, there's clearly no question whatsoever. The work that Leo Gerard, the head of the Steelworkers Union, and I did together, Leo believes and I believe probably saved 100,000 jobs in America. And frankly, that's the series of events I'm most proud of in my entire career. Second, there was talk in one of the press about International Auto Components and a couple of hundred jobs being moved to Mexico during a little time period. During that same time period, we grew net our jobs in this country to 11,000 jobs, which was more than a 10% increase from what we had before it. The only reason we moved a couple of workers to Mexico was our business is making interior parts for cars. Those are just-in-time deliveries, so you have to be right contiguous to the factory that you're supplying, the original equipment manufacturer factory. The customer of those factories that laid the people off moved to Mexico, so there was no longer a customer. That customer asked us to relocate workers to Mexico. We really didn't have much alternative to do so, because once the customer is gone, and since he insists that you be right next door to him so that he doesn't have to keep any inventory, we had no choice. But net, IAC was an adder of jobs. Similarly, International Textile Group, it is true that it had to reduce its workforce. It is also true we are probably the last large domestic manufacturer of textiles left standing, with maybe one or two other exceptions. And subsequent to our work at ITG, their main union used its pension fund to invest in my funds. So clearly Unite, which is the union that has organized the textile and apparel industry, felt that we did responsible things and that we were certainly not anti-worker. I think in reality, if we hadn't also begun some foreign operations, we would have had to shut down far more of the domestic activities. So I believe if you add and subtract, we have been a very large net creator of jobs during this whole period in the United States.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to take the prerogative to ask one more question, and I emphasized it in my opening remarks. Under the NOAA Scientific Integrity Policy, NOAA scientists do not need to ask for permission to share their expertise on scientific matters with the public or with the press. Do you support that right?
I support the dissemination of valid information to the public. I don't think that valid information should be concealed. And in general, I have great respect for the scientific quality of NOAA. It's my understanding that there are 4 Nobel Prize winners at NOAA, and that is certainly a measure of their expertise. So I think that communication of factual information and data is very, very important.
Do you consider the rise of the sea level as valid scientific data?
It's very hard for me, Senator Nelson, to parse which part of data is what. But in general, I think that there will be a very big report forthcoming from NOAA. Every 3 years, they send a report to the International Climate Group. That should be coming out very, very shortly. And I think it will be very, very interesting to see what their updated findings are on that topic as well as on other topics.
Well, Mr. Chairman, just in closing, I will point out that NOAA and NASA measurements over the course of the last 4 decades have shown in southeast Florida measurements of the sea level rise from 5 to 8 inches. That is data that should be reported again in this report that you're talking about that's coming out. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Since you've asked me, sir, not to edit the report, I probably won't have any control over whether they put those specific facts in or not, but I'm sure they're mindful of the facts.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. I've got Senator Cantwell, followed by Senator Blunt, followed by Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thought you were going back and forth. Okay. Don't leave the room. I guess that's the key thing there. Mr. Ross, I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned obviously maritime and fisheries, and for us in the Northwest, this is big jobs, $30 billion in annual revenue and 148,000 direct and indirect jobs as a maritime sector. And I don't have the information right in front of me, but your ethics documentation is not requiring you to divest of your shipping company, thank you, of your Diamond Shipping Company, which operates 33 tanker vessels and transports petroleum products of over $1.2 billion. Is that correct? You're not divesting from that?
That is correct. The research we've done suggests that there has never been a shipping case come before the Department of Commerce. And in our case, the vessels are the most environmentally up-to-date vessels that you're going to find on the water. As you know, there are some new regulations coming in about ballast water and other things. We believe that our vessels, even before those rules came in, have been very well brought, for the most part, up to snuff. So we're proud that the vessels are the best we can do environmentally. In addition, we don't take any risk in the cargo. We simply are like a taxi cab. They put cargo on it, we discharge it in another location, and we're paid a fee for so doing. But I will have no involvement with the operation of the business.
And I think my question, well, first of all, I'm sure when we get into larger infrastructure discussions, there'll be a lot of members of this committee that will say, what can we do to provide more shipbuilding jobs in the United States of America? And I would think there's probably many members of this panel who believe in shipbuilding in the United States and that there's much more to do and state of the art. But I'm sure you remember the Exxon Valdez. And I'm sure you remember that pristine waters that reach the shores all throughout the Pacific Northwest are of high economic value. I'm sure you get that being a Floridian, that there is a high economic value to the pristine coastlines of a state.
Sure.
So my question, and I'm happy to provide this for you for the record, but there are many, 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 many aspects to your new job that will be about the regulation of this industry. The Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund and how much shippers pay into that. There is, obviously after the Deepwater Horizon catastrophe, similar issues. The Oil Pollution Act governing our maritime liability and response. So I want to make sure that as these issues are discussed within your organization, if you're still going to hold that position in that company, whether you're going to recuse yourself from those issues.
Well, on issues, our vessels are only transoceanic vessels. We are not Jones Act participants, so we don't do port to port.
Do you support the Jones Act?
The Jones Act is a fact. I've been living with it. I've never voiced any opposition to it. It's just not relevant to what we've been doing. But the Jones Act has been useful in continuing U.S. shipbuilding. I think without the Jones Act, you'd have even less U.S. shipbuilding than you have now because of the requirement that the intra-coastal activities be Jones Act qualified vessels and Jones Act qualified crews.
Well, I want to make sure that I will get this and you can respond in writing, but there will be times in which the influence of those interests will be impacted by decisions made by your organization. And if you would take a look at these specific questions and areas of where you would recuse yourself, in addition to what you've already done with ethics, I would so appreciate this.
I intend to be quite scrupulous about recusal in any topic where there's the slightest scintilla of doubt.
Thank you. Well, we'll get that to you. I have a few seconds left. Can you tell me, obviously in the private sector, listen, the President-elect's administration is trying to bring in a lot of private sector experience. I appreciate private sector experience, but oftentimes that experience is about answering to shareholders and other special interests. This is about answering to the public interest. And in this issue, as it regards to the huge issues we have on pensions, we've had so many things that have happened in this last several years of an economy where people have been able to come in, reap the assets of companies and organizations, and then leave the federal government or the workers with the liability. Do you support shoring up the miners' pension multi-employer program, and do you support shoring up the PCBG?
Well, let me talk about the pension situation in general. What happens in bankruptcy court is that the debtor, not the potential buyer, but the debtor itself, has the burden of proving to the court that it is not reorganizable without dealing with the pension and retiree health liabilities. The court makes that determination. In every case where we bought and where the pension plan was terminated, that decision had been made by the court prior to our advent on the scene. So the idea that we terminated anybody's pension plan is simply false.
I'm not asking that. So, and I'm out of time, but if you can't right now, we can come back in round two. But I want to know now, as wearing that hat, I was a Commerce Secretary, I want to know what your viewpoint is from the worker perspective and whether you support shoring up that aspect of the pension program. And you can, since I'm out of time, Mr. Chair, we can go to round two, or we can get a written answer on those questions.
Should I answer the question, sir?
Well, if can be very, very brief.
I will. I'm quite familiar with Pension Benefit Guarantee Corp., and as you know, Commerce has a board seat on PBGC. They are the insurer of last resort. I think they need to be even more scrupulous about risk-based pricing so that they themselves don't run out of money as further pension obligations find their way to them.
Thank you, Senator Cantwell. Senator Blunt.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Ross, for being here, for being willing to serve, and I look forward to your leadership at Commerce and what I think, from everything I read, would be an expanded role beyond Commerce because of the President-elect's confidence in you. On the infrastructure side, we had Secretary Chow, former Secretary of Labor, and I suspect the future Secretary of Transportation, in the other day. And one of the questions I asked her was about the importance of a better intermodal strategy for transportation. You know, where I live in Missouri, the Mississippi River is there, the Missouri River flows into the Mississippi, but across we are really at the water nexus of the country, but also the rail and highway nexus of the country. I'm sure all of those need to work together even better for us to have the competitive potential we need. And I'd like you to talk just a little bit about your sense of how we look at those a more interrelated transportation system.
Well, as you know, we have been in the rail car manufacturing business for quite a long time, and one of our major products were the types of cars that are best suited to intermodal, because there's a role for truck, there's a role for barges, there's a role for rail. And I think people keep trying and will eventually succeed at finding new and better ways to facilitate those transfers from one mode of transportation to another. I think that's a very, very vital thing for this country, because for many industries, transportation cost is as much as 20% of their total cost. So anything that can be done to facilitate transportation will help the economy just in and of itself, let alone infrastructure spending has a very high labor content, generally around 44%. So it's a very good way to provide high-paying jobs to ordinary people.
And in the, if I understood your sort of your three-level matrix of how you finance, one was things that have an obvious and easy to understand financing component that have access to the credit world because of that. Another may have some component like a rural cable that could pay part of the bill but not all the bill. But then in the middle you had that greater category of things that just can't happen without a partnership. Would you give me an idea both of what one of those might be and what the private sector opportunity that we're not seeing or not using effectively could be as we look down the road?
Yes, sir. I think we're fortunate to be coming to grips with infrastructure in a relatively low interest rate environment, because that will facilitate getting a lot of projects done that could not be done in a lower interest rate environment, because there would be a crowding out effect. But even so, there will be, in many cases, a need either for the public policy decision to have government play a direct role, or for a way to encourage private sector to participate. So I think it won't be one size fits all. It's a very large and very complex problem, and it needs very large, very inventive, and complex solutions.
And you're also proposing that as you look at infrastructure that we're making a greater effort to incorporate new technologies into that infrastructure?
Yes, sir. And that's a lot of what we're doing in Florida right now. It's not just to get away from the hurricanes. We're also building in extra conduit beyond even the optical fiber that we're putting in the first instance to allow for potential developments in the future, because it's a lot easier to lay the second or third conduit at the same time than it would be to have to close that up and then come back 5 years from now. So we've been trying to get a little bit ahead of the game. And in that particular case, it's being financed by tax-exempt bonds.
So Senator Klobuchar and I have been particularly involved in the travel and tourism issues, thinking that often described as the low-hanging fruit in the economy, particularly foreign travel to our country. Current Secretary has been very interested in that. It's part of the portfolio of commerce. Would you talk just a little bit about that and how it impacts the economy?
Surely. First of all, having been involved, I worked with the labor unions in the Pan American World Airways bankruptcy. I was their financial advisor, was bondholder advisor in TWA, preferred stock advisor in Eastern. So I'm pretty familiar with the airline industry, and actually had been on the board of Wien Airlines up in Alaska for quite a while. I'm a big proponent of the open skies policy. I think that's an important thing. I think developing tourism is extremely important, and I think something like a ninth of all the jobs in this country are one way or another dependent on tourism. So it is a powerful economic factor, and it is one of the segments of Commerce Department that I will certainly be paying attention to if confirmed.
And I just say in closing, Mr. Chairman, and to Mr. Ross, it's also an area where we've got a very active public-private effort going on right now to encourage people to discover America. So thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blunt. Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much. Congratulations on your nomination, Mr. Ross, and thank you, Senator Blunt, for asking those important tourism questions. Of course, Senator Blunt and I won't ask you if you think the Mall of America in Bloomington or Branson, Missouri are better places to visit than Florida, but I think one of our reasons in taking this on is there's tourism all across America. That's very important. I want to lead with something you and I discussed, and that is iron ore and steel. My state, as you know, is one of the leading producers of iron ore. It's in my family. My grandpa worked as an iron ore miner 1,500 feet underground most of his life. We've had an incredible downturn due in part to overcapacity, but also steel dumping that is illegal. And recently, there have been some good actions taken by the Commerce Department. Congress has given more funds, which has been helpful, and we've seen a bit of improvement. And I wondered if you could address how you would build on this work and improve it even more for our hardworking miners and people in the steel industry.
Well, sure. As you can appreciate, I probably have greater familiarity with mining than most people up for this position. The fundamental problem with the steel industry is overcapacity, particularly in China. China has 1 billion tons of capacity. That's half of the world's capacity. They need something like 700 million tons domestically. They're actually producing 800 million tons and putting 100 million tons out into the world markets, often at dumping prices. And so I think one of the things where we do need very careful attention to more tariff activity is the anti-dumping requirements that we should impose on the steel industry and on the aluminum industry as well. That's a very big issue. And unfortunately, until fairly recently, Europe was even more reticent to impose countervailing duties than we are. But finally, they seem to be feeling the pinch of it, and they're starting to come around as well.
As you know, they just launched the Global Forum on Steel Excess Capacity in Berlin in December. So I assume you'll be willing to work with our allies on that.
Oh, absolutely. I know many of them anyway, because Arcelor had been very active throughout Europe.
Okay, thank you. And will you work with our Customs and Border Patrol? You and I discussed that, the issue of these shipments coming in with illegal steel.
Yes. One of the things that horrified me as I studied about enforcement is there are literally billions of dollars of countervailing duties that are never collected because the foreigners set up little shell companies here. We impose a duty. There's nobody home when we come time to collect. I think that kind of thing has to be fixed. There's not much point going through a multi-year trade case if then, in case you win, you don't even collect the countervailing duties. That doesn't change anybody's behavior, and it's a loss of revenue to the federal government.
Thank you, and I appreciate that. I think that's one of the reasons you just got the steelworkers' support with Leo Gerard and a letter dated January 9th. Last thing I wanted to ask you about was Cuba. I lead the bill to lift the embargo. I know that it's an issue in Florida on both sides, and we, of course, have Republican support on this bill as well. My view is 50-plus years of a failed policy is enough. What's your position on ending the embargo? And then also a second question related would be the rollbacks. If there was any plans to, you think we should be rolling back any of the existing opportunities for American air carriers, businesses that have come about because of President Obama's executive orders, because a lot of these businesses in America are making plans. We have 1.5 million visitors now forecasted from our own country a year.
Well, I must make a confession. I've never been in Cuba, so I have no firsthand knowledge. I do have quite a number of Cuban-American friends in Florida, and I notice that it's a sufficiently complex issue that even within individual families, there are people who disagree about what should be done. So it's one area I'd like to become much more educated in as time goes. I am aware that Starwood and some other hotel people have already made some deals for Cuba, so there seems to be a lot of interest on the part of American companies in doing business there. But I don't feel I'm expert enough in that right now to have a firm view.
All right. Well, we look forward to talking with you about that. I will put on the record some questions about, I appreciated you raising broadband, the Dig Once proposal we have when people are digging for utilities to also make sure we lay fiber for broadband, and then also the importance of the foreign commercial service, and finally softwood lumber. But we can leave that for the written questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. Senator Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Ross, welcome. Appreciate your willingness to serve and your previous service to our country. And you know, you and I talked about it in our meeting before this hearing, but I had an opportunity to have a front row seat in some ways, working at the National Security Council staff at the White House on economic issues, what happened with the steel industry and what you were able to do. And I think that's something that is an important and positive part of your record. And I know that there's thousands and thousands of steel workers who appreciated that. We also had the opportunity to talk about to me, one of the most important issues that we can face as a nation right now, and that's the issue of economic growth. And as you know, the last 10 years, we've had a lost decade of economic growth. President Obama is going to be the first president never to hit 3% GDP growth ever in a year, almost never hit it in a quarter. And so that's, the Obama administration has now said, well, that's the new normal. We shouldn't expect to hit traditional levels of American growth, 3.5%, 4%, 4.5%. Do you agree with that, that the new normal is something that we're achieving our full maximum potential as an American economy at 1.5%, 2% growth, the numbers of the last 10 years, or can we get back to traditional levels of American growth? And if so, how do we do that?
I think we can. During the campaign, I characterized the 1.5%, 2% not as the new normal, but as the new dismal. I don't think we need to have the new dismal.
So you think the narrative that's very pervasive in Washington, D.C., that the new normal is here to stay, this is what we should achieve, this is what we should expect, I think it's a surrender. So you disagree with that?
I'm pretty sure that if that proves true, you won't be seeing me much longer because the president-elect won't put up with it.
So how do we get to traditional levels of American growth, 3.5%, 4%, 4.5%, which, by the way, Democrat and Republican administrations have achieved this. This has been that's the normal for America.
Well, I think I wrote an editorial with Peter Navarro that outlined 4 planks to the economic policy. One was regulatory reform. I'm not against all regulations, obviously, but I do think that pendulum perhaps has swung a bit further than it should. And I believe the president will roll back some of the regulations. I don't know which ones, but I think he'll roll back some. And that's one of the most frequent complaints I hear from the business community is about over-regulation. A second is the energy policy, both making us closer to being energy self-sufficient, because we still are a net importer of energy, and however you look at it, that's a drain on the economy. Third is what we've been talking about before, helping our balance of trade, particularly by increasing the exports. I think if we combine each of those and just get a fraction of a percent more growth from each, we'll get to the kinds of numbers that you were talking about. And last, of course, being the infrastructure. We desperately need infrastructure, not only because of the direct jobs it creates, but inefficient and archaic infrastructure is itself a drain on the economy. The grid, all kinds of things have to be fixed if we're going to be a truly competitive economy.
Thank you, and we want to work with you on those 4 elements of getting back to the traditional levels of American growth. I want to talk next, and I appreciate you highlighting the issue of fisheries and their importance to coastal communities. You know, in my state of Alaska, employment in the fishing industry is actually bigger than even in the oil and gas industry. So healthy coastal communities, a well-managed, sustainable fishery. Our fishery is considered probably the most well-managed, sustainable fishery on the planet. Is very important. I have the honor of chairing the subcommittee on oceans and fisheries and the Coast Guard on this committee. So I just want to get your commitment that, as you know, a big part of the Commerce Department is NOAA, is fisheries, is focusing on that data to keep our fisheries well managed. I just want to get your commitment to working with this committee, working with me, working with the subcommittee on those important issues for the country, for my state, and also on some of the personnel decisions that you'll be making, that the administration will be making, on having the best people who understand fisheries, understand Alaska. You know, I like to say we're the superpower of seafood. Almost 60% of all seafood harvested in the United States comes from Alaska's waters. So, if confirmed, I'd like to get your commitment to working closely with us on those important issues.
Well, you certainly have it, and I am very mindful of the discussion we had about king crabs coming in from Russia as part of our trade problem, and I assure you that too will be something I'll look into if confirmed.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Sullivan. Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to the committee, and thank you for being willing to serve, Mr. Ross. Let me begin where my colleague, Senator Sullivan, finished. On the issue of fisheries, as you know, you have very substantial authority under your emergency powers to correct for inequities and overfishing. I'd like a commitment that you will consider using those emergency powers to address the flow of certain fish stocks, which you and I have discussed, from the Middle Atlantic states to the New England states, without the authority to fish at sufficient quotas for the fishermen of New England.
Right. Well, I do remember very clearly our conversation, and I think it will be important to make sure that quotas are allocated properly. I'll need to do research to follow up on the indications you gave me in order to figure out exactly where I come out on exact details.
This system is broken. It is broken from an environmental and an economic standpoint. It's costing jobs, and it is preventing the United States from using its fish stocks, and instead, as you and I discussed, has resulted in importing,
Right.
which destroys livelihoods and economic well-being in the New England states. And I'd like your commitment that
Yep.
you will work with me to use your emergency powers, but also to support legislative reform.
I'm very interested in helping balance the payments. Very interested in helping the fisheries, so I look forward to seeing the details of the suggested legislation.
And I want to welcome your modification, I'll put it somewhat delicately, of the plan that you and Mr. Navarro submitted, or your clarification of it, to permit other authorities like an infrastructure bank and a public financing authority, which I think are key to the public side of investment, and there has to be a robust public investment in our infrastructure, taking advantage of the low-interest environment that you very correctly suggested.
I think we're very fortunate, Senator, that it is a low-interest rate environment where we're trying to solve this problem. If it were a very high-interest rate environment, the problem would be 2 or 3 times as hard to solve.
Let me focus on another area where I think you have really made a very personal sacrifice. Your service has resulted in your divesting yourself of literally hundreds of millions of dollars in assets so that you could reach an agreement with the Office of Government Ethics. I don't want to embarrass you or presume, but obviously, of all of the billions of dollars in holdings that you own now, you have divested more than 90%. You have resigned from 50 positions. The process has been enormously complex and challenging and costly to you personally, correct?
Yes, sir.
And I want to ask you very directly, shouldn't the President of the United States do the same?
Well, as I understand it, the ethics rules that apply to Senate-approved nominees do not apply to the President.
But simply as a matter of appearance and morality, for that matter. You were able to do it. Why not the President?
I'm not familiar enough, Senator, with the exactitudes of his holdings to have any judgment as to how easy or hard it would be to do it.
You did it to avoid any conflicts of interest, correct?
That is correct, sir.
You now had an agency that will have direct authority that potentially could impact very seriously the President's financial well-being, correct? You had, for example, the Patent and Trademark Office.
Yes, sir.
The President's organization has 8 pending applications for new trademarks. His trademarks for hotel, clothing, real estate could well come before the Trademark Trial and Appeal Board. You appoint that board, correct?
Well, I had a discussion yesterday morning with the current head of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, and I asked her how she was dealing with the matters relating to her former relationship with Google. And she outlined what I thought was a very thorough process for recusal and determining recusal, and I would intend to emulate the standard that she has set.
But there's no way to avoid a conflict of interest when the one with that interest is the President of the United States. He is your boss. He's her boss. He is the one who presides over the entire United States government, and you appoint the judges who will sit on that appeals board, correct?
That is correct.
And so I would respectfully suggest that that conflict of interest is inevitable so long as the President of the United States refuses to divest himself. Creating the trust that he has done is no substitute for complete divestiture. I realize you can't order him to do so, but you will be, in effect, put in a very difficult, if not impossible, position as the Secretary of Commerce, who has appointing authority and ultimately approval authority over the Patent and Trademarks Office.
Well, I'm quite sure everyone will be watching all of those matters, and therefore they will certainly be subject to public scrutiny.
My time has expired. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Senator Heller.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Mr. Ross, congratulations to you and to Hillary and to any family member that may be here or may be watching today's hearing. I'm grateful that you're here, and I'm grateful that you are willing to take this upon yourself. The article that you referred to, based on the questioning from Mr. Sullivan, that you wrote on your 4 platforms for economic growth, and you mentioned regulatory reform. And I thought about that a little bit. You said you weren't sure where the president might be on regulatory reform or what he's going to do the first days of office. Not knowing that, what would you recommend to him with your background and experience that would help immediately in regulatory reform?
Well, I think what we ought to do is to try to deal with things that really inhibit business and yet aren't all that important, a kind of cost-benefit analysis. The part of the CBO that reviews regulations is a very small department. I think it has fewer than 50 employees. So many, many new things that have been put in have never had a cost-benefit analysis. I think the majority of them, in fact, have not. It would be very useful to conduct that kind of analysis as part of the process for determining which things should be rolled back and which should be preserved.
So you don't have any specific recommendation at this point?
At this point, no. The president has not asked me for specific recommendations.
I appreciate your comments, though, on cost-benefit analysis. I've been arguing for that since I've been here in Congress, that any new regulation that comes out of this committee or any other committee should have to be run through some cost-benefit analysis in order to be assured that it isn't costing more than the benefits of that particular regulation. Let's go down to the balance of trade. You mentioned that as your 4 steps also. What's your thought process here on increasing trade?
A couple of things. One, in general, I think it's easier and quicker to negotiate bilateral agreements than it is multilateral. And my concerns about the multilaterals are not that there's anything inherently wrong with them, but as somebody who has negotiated a lot of transactions, I can tell you, the more complex the environment within which you're negotiating, the less likely you are to get to a sensible result. Because what really happens is several things. Say you're negotiating with 12 different countries. You go to the first one and you want some concession from them. They say, yes, we'll give you that concession, but we want something back. So that takes a little nick out of us. Then you go to the next country, you negotiate with them, they take a little nick. Keep doing that 12 times, you get a lot of nicks. And what happens is the other countries get the benefit of things they didn't even ask for because you had to give them to someone else. So I think that's a fundamental concern. Second,
Mr. Ross, I hate to cut you off because I don't have a lot of time, but am I to take from that you weren't impressed with TPP?
Initially, when I read the first press reports of TPP, was very favorable toward it. As I delved into the thousands of pages of document, I came across some things that I felt were not consistent with what had been advertised. I'll give you a couple of examples. One is the concept of TPP was to build a wall around the countries that were participants. But in automotive, for example, they permit more than 60% of the content of a car to come from outside TPP and yet have all the tariff benefits. That didn't strike me as the world's best idea, particularly from the point of view of protecting the automotive industry, because in automotive, about 70% of the jobs are in the parts suppliers, not in the OEs.
Again, sorry to cut you off, but I only have a couple seconds here.
I'm sorry.
Would that argument be that you would then oppose a 35% tariff as the president-elect has proposed on foreign cars?
I think that it's a complicated issue whether you should have one flat tariff on everything or whether it should be more tailored to the individual situations. And I think
do you support tariffs?
I think tariffs play a role both as a negotiating tool and, if necessary, to punish offenders who don't play by the rules.
Mr. Chairman, my time's run out. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Heller. Senator Wicker has returned, and he's up next.
Well, thank you very much. Mr. Ross, there's been a lot of talk about outsourcing.
About, I'm sorry, sir?
Outsourcing of jobs.
Yes, sir.
And we need to continue talking about that. But the other side of that is insourcing. And I can just tell you that in my state of Mississippi, we're tickled to death to have Toyota, Nissan, Airbus, Yokohama Tire, building things for the rest of the world and employing Americans right there in Mississippi. Of course, our states have a lot to do with recruiting these industries, but can you highlight for us your ideas about how to have more of this as we try to combat outsourcing of American jobs to other countries? How can we insource companies like Nissan and Toyota and Airbus?
Sure. I think the best incentive for foreign companies to come here is, first of all, we're the world's largest markets, and so that's a big encouragement. But if we lowered the corporate tax rate, it'll be a further inducement for them to come. Right now, we're not competitive in terms of our marginal tax rate with many other countries against whom we compete. Take, for example, Mexico. The corporate tax rate there is about half what it is in our country, and that's true in many of the other countries. So I think if we can become more competitive in the tax rate, would be a very good thing, not only for keeping American companies staying here, but also for encouraging foreign companies to come here. So I think that's probably the biggest single tool that we could use.
Okay, that's the biggest single tool. You're free to give other suggestions.
Oh, surely. I think some degree of deregulation would also be very, very helpful. And if we can use an energy policy that keeps energy costs low, that would be very, very powerful as well. So I'm much more in favor of carrots than of sticks.
With regard to a 21st century tax structure that puts us more in line with the modern day and gets us now out of 1986, are you involved in those discussions at the transition level, and will you be part of writing the administration's tax proposal?
I believe the President will be listening to some suggestions from me, but he has a whole apparatus on tax that's quite independent of me. But because tax is so important to commerce, I hope that he will have some consultation with me.
Well, I think based on your answer to the previous question, the President-elect would be well advised to listen to you. You've had a lot to say about infrastructure, and let me just tell you, I hope I'm able to assist the Trump administration in supporting an infrastructure program for the United States of America. Infrastructure includes roads, bridges, highways, rail. Do you consider the build-out of broadband to be part of infrastructure, and should it be part of the Trump administration's infrastructure plan?
I think broadband is an essential part. Broadband is to a very large degree a path to the future, and I think, therefore, it's a very essential component of economic policy altogether, including the infrastructure component.
All right, and you're going to look around the room here and see people from Nevada to Hawaii to Mississippi to Nebraska, and a lot of rural folks on this committee. I hope you will commit to this Congress and to this committee that you will work with us on making rural broadband more accessible and make the build-out more expeditious.
I certainly will try to cooperate with you. As you know, that it's the intersection of myriad policy decisions, some of which are quite outside my control.
You're probably aware of this, and my time has expired, but you've been around the track. There is a second level of bureaucracy in your department. There's a third level of bureaucracy. You're going to have to fight those people. And sometimes you're going to have to make sure that they understand that elections have consequences. I want to do a shout out to your predecessor, Secretary Pritzker, who helped Senator Cochran and me and the governor of our state and the people in Mississippi who wanted to save lives through an innovative way to put doctors in emergency vehicles, and it took quite an effort on the part of Secretary Pritzker to cut through that bureaucracy and make sure the law was followed. I hope you can show that kind of determination too, and we can work on a bipartisan basis with people, with my Democratic friends and people on our side of the aisle too, to cut through some of this red tape and do things like Secretary Pritzker did in helping save lives for Americans in Mississippi.
Certainly in favor of saving lives, and I'm clearly certainly in favor of enforcing the law. So I look forward to working with you on it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Senator Wicker. Next up is Senator Schatz, followed by Senator Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ross, thank you for your commitment to serve the public. Your predecessor successfully negotiated a couple of very thorny issues over the last few years regarding telecommunications, the U.S.-EU Privacy Shield and the IANA transition. The successful negotiation of the U.S.-EU Privacy Shield and the smooth transition of the IANA functions from the Department of Commerce to the global multi-stakeholder community were widely supported by a range of stakeholders, including the Congress. Do I have your commitment to continuity in these respects?
Well, as I understand it, there is no real alternative on the table to the ICAP situation. So for the moment, there's nothing else to consider. I'm not aware that there's a realistic way to do anything about it. On the privacy side of life, I think we need to balance a couple of things going forward. The agreements that exist obviously exist, but I think going forward there will be a tension between privacy on the one hand and problems of localization of data and the implications that they have for the internet as we go forward. So I think that's going to be a very tricky balancing act, but I look forward to consulting with you on it.
Thank you. In fiscal 2016, the NOAA budget was about $6 billion, making up 60% of the Department of Commerce's budget. But in recent years, NOAA's budget has stagnated as critical coastal and ocean programs have been held level to pay for satellites. As a result, NOAA has had to rely on aging, rundown buoys and ships to measure high-impact global ocean conditions such as El Nino. El Nino events originate in the Western Pacific, as you know, but their impact is felt around the world. The data that NOAA gathers in the Pacific using a small network of buoys is essential for forecasting these impacts across the country. These NOAA coastal and ocean programs are critical, but they're not as interesting, not as expensive as the satellite programs that you referred to earlier. What is the strategy to restore balance to the NOAA budget so that all of its critical programs are adequately funded?
Well, the big capital expenditures right now are for the satellites. As you know, there are several more that are scheduled to be launched. And then the next biggest capital expenditures will be to update the vessels. As someone who's operated vessels, I'm well aware that old vessels are quite inefficient to operate, number one. And number two, that the technology of these research ships has improved quite a bit in the years since those vessels were built. To the best of my knowledge, they actually are beyond their depreciable life, so they're pretty ancient. It's for appropriations and finance to wrestle through how much money do we get all together and how much of that gets spent on what. But I do think that it's important to continue both the existing service functions and meet these very pressing capital expenditure needs. There's a similar problem with the census. It's been hard getting commitments for the appropriation that census really needs for its mission, and that's something I hope we'll have further discussion about as well.
I'd like to follow up on Senator Nelson's question regarding scientific integrity. As you know, in 2011, NOAA adopted an explicit scientific integrity policy, essentially ensuring independence for NOAA scientists. I'm satisfied with your answer, both in this forum as well as in our private conversations. But just so that the record is totally clear, do you intend to uphold the 2011 scientific integrity policy?
Well, as I've said, I believe that science is science, and scientists should perform science. I haven't studied the intricate details, frankly, of that document, so I can't make a formal commitment to it. But as to the general concept of scientists doing the science, I'm totally in support of that.
Thank you. And finally, on the question of trying to facilitate the reaching of our goal with respect to international visitors, and there are a lot of members of this committee who care very deeply about tourism. Part of the role of the Department of Commerce is not just to be a cheerleader for that stated goal that the Department of Commerce under Secretary Pritzker established, but to serve as a convener, because there has to be a little bit of wrangling among departments. Some of the issues have to do with the Department of Transportation and their throughput capacity, certainly the Department of Homeland Security and Customs and Border Protection. So can we have your commitment to continue the leadership of Secretary Pritzker in terms of convening the agencies and working with the White House and making sure that as we deal with all of our security and homeland security concerns, that commerce and tourism and those national policy objectives have a seat at the table?
Well, I know Secretary-designate Chow quite well from some of her former incarnations, and I look forward to working with her on stimulating tourism.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Schott. Senator Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Nelson, as well as Mr. Ross, for being here this morning. Thank you to your family for being here. I'm all the way over here at the end, so it's, yeah, that's, I know. Elaine Chao was here last week, and I think she actually thought I was in the audience sitting over here, so thanks for your willingness to serve the country and appreciate the time we've been able to spend together in the office. Colorado, we talked a little bit about trade and the importance of trade in Colorado. $9 billion worth of exports from Colorado, about half of which, $4.5 billion worth of goods annually, are sent to nations in Asia, and half of our state's exports go to Asian nations. Given the position of the new administration on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, how do we make sure that we are increasing American exports abroad? And just as importantly, what areas, what markets do you see as the most lucrative opportunities for the U.S. in the next 4 years?
Well, that's obviously a very complex question, and we discussed it some in your office. The things we're the best at in many ways are the technologically advanced things, and I think more research and development, more encouragement of technological breakthrough is clearly an important thing. But at the same time, we need to protect our existing industries because they really are very much labor intensive. And I think we also are going to have to cope with the challenge that's combined with the opportunity of some of the technological advances. For example, driverless cars are probably a very good thing. They seem to be, in any event, an inevitable thing, but that presumably will also lead to driverless trucks. Well, there's something like 3 million American adults who depend on over-the-road trucks for their livelihood, and it's a pretty good livelihood. And then you also have the shorter trip drivers as well. So I think what we have to do is to figure out how to make sure we get the benefits of the improved technology and yet cope with the dislocation that it inevitably will produce in certain of the industries. So I think that's going to be a real balancing act.
Thank you. In my opportunities to meet with leaders from around the globe, it's very important that we make sure that we continue to be a leader in trade and exports in commerce, because as nations look to other nations for leadership, as they look to economic opportunity, we need to make sure that international norms are set on standards that we believe are best for the world and economic opportunity, and not give other nations a chance to take over U.S. leadership is very important, because they're relying on the United States to continue to lead. I want to thank you for your opening statement. Senator Rubio and I last year, and will continue to work this year, on evaluation of federal spectrum holdings to make sure that we understand the opportunity cost that having that spectrum held and not utilized means to this country and to the government. So thank you very much for that commitment to the valuation. The National Institute of Standards and Technology has a laboratory in Boulder, Colorado, a major campus. Of course, one of the key areas of work that NIST at Boulder pursues is cyber areas. It's a non-regulatory approach that NIST continues, and that's their mission. But they do a lot of work when it comes to cyber. I'm very concerned about our construct in government, the way Congress works, the way our executive branch works when it comes to understanding cyber, being fully capable of implementing ideas that will protect both our private sector as well as national security interests. And so will the Trump administration, will you at Commerce can you commit to continue preserving the non-regulatory status of NIST to ensure that this work with the private sector on cyber can continue?
Well, I think cyber, if nothing else, was a big enough issue in the campaign that everybody is very sensitized to it for very local reasons. But it is going to be an increasing issue from a whole variety of directions. And again, it's one of these that's very complicated. You don't want to compromise the privacy side of things. On the other hand, you need real-world protection against people who intend to do us harm, economic harm or military harm. So I think that's a difficult thing that will have to be balanced, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if that'll be the kind of thing that'll come before the Congress over and over again.
Thank you. In 2015, there were estimates in 2015 that up to $2 billion a day was lost in economic productivity due to the West Coast port slowdown. Labor agreements for workers of the West Coast and East Coast ports are scheduled for near simultaneous expiration in both 2018 and 2019, respectively. 2019 for West Coast, 2018 for East Coast. Last Congress, I introduced the Ports Act, which would have provided governors with the flexibility to address slowdowns and strikes at our nation's ports to reduce the damage of such catastrophes. Given how these are approaching, these dates are quickly approaching, and future labor negotiations are moving, how do you plan to avoid similar disruptions at our ports, and will you commit to making sure we have an understanding report on the economic impact they would have?
Well, thank you, is a very good and very complex question. We have tried very hard in our commercial activities to avoid strikes and slowdowns and things of that sort. I think in general those are the failure of negotiation, and I think therefore the first thing is to try to figure out how can there be a better process for negotiation so that we come to a resolution without this sort of showdown at the OK Corral. I think that's number one, preventive medicine. Number two, that is clearly much more in the province of Labor Secretary than it would be Commerce. We will be interested observers, and given that we've had a history with successful work with Labor, to the degree that they want, I'll be glad to give my thoughts on how to try to help.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Gardner. That is an important issue because it affects the supply chain. Everybody was very much impacted by that incident a year ago. Senator Peters is up next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ross, welcome to the committee. I appreciate the time that we spent in the office together talking about a variety of issues, and certainly one thing that I was very pleased to hear was your extensive knowledge of Michigan and the industry there, with the work that you did with the steel industry as well as automotive sector and other industries there. And I'm particularly pleased as well with the comments that you made in regard to a question made by one of my colleagues here related to TPP and the impact that the TPP would have on the auto industry, a very negative impact. in particular with the suppliers in that industry. And so it would have had a devastating impact on jobs. And it's not about protecting the auto industry. This is just about having fair rules where we treat the auto industry and the workers in America fairly with others. And we know we can outcompete anybody as long as the rules are fair. And I appreciate your stance on that and your comments. And along those lines, I wanted to address something that is critically important, which is enforcement. If we're dealing with any kind of rules, whether they're trade deals or the legal authority under the WTO, certainly the administration will play a vital role. In fact, you, as confirmed as the Secretary of Commerce, will play a vital role in enforcing those rules. And under current law, the Secretary can self-initiate anti-dumping and countervailing duty investigations. However, the use of this tool under previous administrations, I'm sad to say, has been virtually non-existent. In fact, I think the last time was in the 1990s. It's been a long time since Commerce Department has self-initiated these types of investigations. And normally we only have investigations that are initiated after a formal complaint by an industry. You know firsthand about that from your work in the steel industry. And that's a very imperfect process. Usually it's large companies with high-priced lobbyists. They get noticed and get action in the Commerce Department. But if you're dealing with small and mid-sized businesses in Michigan and other states around the country, they don't have the resources, and the impact of unfair trade practices often goes unnoticed and unfortunately not investigated. If confirmed, will you be more aggressive and commit to using your legal authority as Secretary to enforce the rules protecting against unfair trade practices and self-initiate anti-dumping and countervailing duty investigations?
As we discussed, Senator, when I was in your office, I'm an activist, and I think that that tool of self-initiation is a very useful one for several reasons. One is the one you mentioned, industries that have a lot of small companies, very hard for them to get the data together, to get the funding together, and worst of all, it takes a very long time for them to initiate a case. I think the duration of these cases has got to be shortened, and if anything we can do to shorten it at the front end would be good. Self-initiation is a very good tool for that, and I think it's a good tool in another regard, in that, to me, part of any negotiation is the psychology of the participants, and to the degree that we show them we're willing to self-initiate, that's a more aggressive stand on cheating than perhaps has been exemplified before. So I think it's important both from its actual curative effect, its preventive effect, and the psychological effect on the cheaters.
Well, I appreciate that answer, Mr. Ross. And I guess the pushback that we have had from previous administrations as we've attempted to do this is that they have said that they lack some of the resources necessary. That's why I've led efforts to fund the Interagency Center on Trade Implementation, Monitoring, and Enforcement, which is a mouthful, but what they do is assist our efforts in trying to get these self-initiated enforcement. So I'd hope that I could enlist your support with bipartisan support here in Congress to provide resources necessary to do that critical function.
Well, we would welcome more resources.
Great, great. Final question, as my time is expiring here. The issue of outsourcing is a critical concern as we continue to see American jobs go overseas, and I know you are committed to trying to stem that tide and bring jobs back and keep the jobs that we have. But what I have found is that it's often difficult to get information as to what jobs are actually being outsourced, where jobs are being created. Companies and others will report that they're hiring workers, but we don't know where those workers necessarily are. We find that the information regarding outsourcing is opaque, incomplete, and often entirely inaccessible. Will you, as Commerce Secretary, commit to work with Congress to develop some new corporate transparency measures that will allow us to have that information so that we can make sure our policies are actively addressing the problem of outsourcing?
Well, I have a very heartfelt saying in management that anything you can't measure, you can't manage. So it's one of the things that's good about the Commerce Department, has all kinds of measurement activities, and was not aware that this was a particular problem. but certainly understanding the parameters of problems helps you figure out how to deal with them. So I look forward to further discussions with you.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Peters. Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you. Welcome, Mr. Ross. It's nice to meet your wife as well. And I want to thank you for taking the time to meet with me, and I thought we had a good conversation. Want to follow up on some of the comments that you've made, just to put it on the record. I suspect based on our conversation, I know where you stand on these. But when it comes to, obviously, tourism in Nevada, it's a very important issue. Most people don't realize, just in 2016 alone, there are approximately 43 million visitors to southern Nevada. It injects $45 billion into our economy and actually provides good paying jobs for 400,000 Nevadans. So something that's very important for Nevada is Brand USA. And we've talked about this, and I just want a commitment. Are you committed to supporting Brand USA as it fits into your strategy to promote travel and tourism?
Everything I've heard about Brand USA is that it's been positive and that it's been helpful. So in the absence of some sort of contrary information, it sounds to me like a pretty good idea.
Great, thank you. Along those lines, the Survey of International Air Travelers is a primary research program which gathers statistical data about air passenger travelers in the U.S., overseas, and the Mexican air markets. And the survey data provides information on passenger trip planning, travel patterns, demographics, and spending. It is a survey that is used to analyze visitor segments, and it is used by the Convention Authority in Southern Nevada and all industry groups. And they use the data directly as part of their marketing plans. Will you commit to expanding the scope and size of the Survey of International Air Travelers so that industry can better target their marketing campaigns and attract more tourists from around the world?
Well, as I've said, Senator, I'm in favor of the idea that you can't manage things that you don't measure. So we need measurement of those kinds of data.
Thank you, and I appreciate that because I'm a big proponent of data analytics, and I don't think we do enough of that, particularly in government. A part of your role will be overseeing the Minority Business Development Agency. I think the small businesses in this country are the backbone of our economy, and particularly in Nevada, there's over 230,000 small businesses, many of them owned by Latinos, Asians, African Americans. One thing I find after talking to the small businesses is the lack of access to capital, particularly access to capital for small and minority businesses, to contracts and markets. We haven't had a discussion on this. I'm questioning your thoughts on promoting and continuing to support minority-owned businesses, not only in Nevada but across this country.
I've been a supporter of minority-owned businesses. In fact, at the International Automotive Group, we have had a number of joint ventures with minority-owned businesses in the auto parts space. And I think they can be done very, very well, and they help develop leadership within those communities so that they can go on and do independent businesses on their own. And I think the automotive industry has been relatively a leader in fostering minority business development.
So can I get your commitment? I know the Minority Business Development Agency has business centers around the country. I think they're underfunded. I think they need more resources to work with our small businesses. Will you commit to looking at that funding and continue to support those centers?
Well, as I explained to you, I very much like the idea. I'm not intimate enough with the details of it yet to know exactly what it needs, but the idea I certainly support.
Thank you. And then finally, we've talked about this as well. Many major U.S. corporations are taking public stances supporting immigration reform efforts because we know that by passing immigration reform, particularly just S-744, that would have contributed to our economy. And I know in our private meeting, we talked about this, and you said you were open to anything that will stimulate the economy. That is our job at Commerce. So a question for you is, can you commit today to supporting a comprehensive immigration reform package with a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants that would be positive for the economy and stimulate job growth?
Well, as I said when we were together, anything that stimulates the economy in truth, I would be in favor of.
Thank you. Mr. Ross, thank you so much, and again, congratulations on your nomination.
Thank you very much, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Cortez Masto. Next up, we have Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ross, I'm over here where Senator Gardner was. First of all, thank you for being willing to leave your life in the private sector and serve our nation here. Truly appreciate that. To me, our number one priority has to be to grow our economy, to make sure that we realize the full potential of this marvel we call the American economy. What do you believe is the growth potential of the American economy? Do you have kind of a figure in your head?
Well, I think we can certainly get north of 3% growth if we do all the elements of the President's program.
By the way, that has been the average since the Great Depression, about 3.2% of the American economy. So I would hope that's a minimum goal. From my standpoint, there are four main reasons we're not achieving that full potential. Overregulation, completely uncompetitive tax system. We're not using our energy resources. And the fourth, I often don't list because there's so many lawyers here, tort reform. Can you talk about, from your perspective, maybe you've got other ones. I know you're talking about expanding exports, but what do you think are the primary reasons, and kind of expand on the answer, if you would, that we're not realizing the full potential of our economy?
Well, I wrote an editorial that outlined what I think are the 4 or 5 key planks. Regulatory reform, not just wildly abolishing all regulation, but doing cost-benefit analysis and having sensible regulation. Second, improving our trade balance, particularly by stimulating exports. Third, having an energy policy that takes advantage of our natural resources and keeps energy prices low. Fourth, an infrastructure program that's a sensible one that leads to more efficiency in the economy and a better capability for dealing with the new technologies as they come through. I think if we do all those and we have a sensible tax system, I think the economy will do very, very well.
Talk about your plans, or what you would think would be best suited towards stimulating exports.
Well, I think the first thing we have to do is to deal with the unfair, both tariff and non-tariff trade barriers that other countries impose on us. It's a little weird that we have very low tariffs and China has very high tariffs. That seems to me to be a bit of an imbalance. And it's one thing to talk about free trade. We would like to have our trading partners also practice free trade and do it in a more balanced manner than has been done at present. So I think a lot of what we need is elimination of inappropriate and, in most cases, improper trade barriers to us. I think American ingenuity, American management, and American labor can compete very, very effectively if it's a fair fight. In a lot of cases, it's not a fair fight.
Talk about the non-tariff trade barriers. You talked earlier about we have to adjudicate those claims in far more rapid fashion, but specifically prioritize and rank how harmful the non-tariff trade barriers are.
Well, take, for example, automobiles. Some countries with whom we've had treaties agreed to lower the tariff, but then they'll suddenly say, we have a different environmental standard for cars than what you have, and your cars don't qualify as environmentally correct in our country. I can't imagine that there's anything that our environmental requirements have missed that other countries have found. So it's clearly just a device to make it more difficult for American companies to have to tailor-make cars for that market. So that's one example. The famous debates over mad cow disease, I think, are another very glaring example. I eat quite a lot of beef, and as far as I know, I don't have mad cow disease, although some people think applying to be Secretary of Commerce is a sign that perhaps I do. But leaving that aside, it's hard for me to imagine that there's any legitimacy to saying that our beef shouldn't be exported to wherever. If it's good enough for Americans to eat, it ought to be good enough for foreigners to eat. So I think those are a couple of glaring examples. Other ones are inordinate delays at the ports for undue inspections, delaying products getting in, just harassing the export process in general. There are myriad ways, and as you can gather, I'm quite familiar with a lot of the tactics because I've been a personal victim of them.
So your approach would be to specifically target those abuses?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Ross. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Johnson. Next up, we have Senator Hassan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Mr. Ross, congratulations on your nomination.
Thank you, Senator.
And I'm sorry I haven't been, we have two hearings going on at the same time, so we're back and forth. And I wanted to thank you again for coming to my office and meeting with me. I wanted to touch on just about three issues. The first, small business. New Hampshire has been rated the best state for business friendliness in the country, and many of the businesses in New Hampshire are small businesses. In fact, the majority of them are. During our meeting, you emphasized that one of the Department of Commerce's main roles in finding ways to help small businesses is to help small businesses find ways to grow and be able to export their products. In the most recent monthly report from the Export-Import Bank, New Hampshire businesses and small businesses financed almost $800,000 in exports from New Hampshire. How will you coordinate and work with other departments and administrations, such as the Small Business Administration and the Ex-Im Bank, through existing or new collaborative programs to achieve these goals?
Well, I believe that we need some mechanism that helps finance exports. All the other countries around the world have one. I know there have been some individual criticisms of various aspects of Ex-Im, but I think the idea of some sort of financing tool, particularly for small businesses, is really important. If you're a little manufacturer somewhere in the heartland and you've never exported, just trying to figure out how do you get letters of credit so that you can really do the business can be daunting.
Yeah.
And I think that part of Department of Commerce with its field offices needs to be even a better outreach to the small business community to say, yes, we know it's a big challenge. We're here to help you. We'll help you figure out the letter of credit. Because however good their product is, if they're not able to work out things like letter of credit, they're not going to export. And I think it's tragic that only a couple percentage points of all American businesses ever export anything. That can't be the best solution, and it can't be the right solution.
Thank you. I wanted to talk a little bit just on what the department and we can all do to help innovation-based companies. In Manchester, New Hampshire, we have businesses like Scribe Software and Retrieve Technologies, Silver Tech, and Dine. And it's really helping us position our largest city as one of the top emerging areas for tech jobs in the country. So how can the Department of Commerce on its own and with other organizations support innovation-based new and young businesses and really help them grow?
Well, I think we need to outreach. There are also private sector enterprises like the National Association of Manufacturers, which has some 14,000 mostly smaller companies as members. I'm very grateful that they are one of the groups that has endorsed my nomination for Commerce, and I intend to work very closely with them because I think they have very many of the similar objectives to what you and I discussed in your office.
Great.
And there are other groups similarly. The state development agencies can also be useful things because more and more states have export development agencies, not just those to attract factories to their locales.
Great. Thank you. Third, and I know a couple of the other senators have touched on the issue of fisheries this morning. I just wanted to touch on a New Hampshire-specific issue. the work that NOAA does is so important, and I look forward to working together with them in the future. It provides essential and sometimes life-saving information and services, weather forecasts, severe storm warnings, climate monitoring. But in New Hampshire, we have a particular issue. We have almost, if not exclusively, a small boat fishing industry. The industry is more sensitive to changes in the fee structure as prescribed by NOAA than many. And in the new rules, NOAA has said that fishermen will have to pay for at-sea monitors, which in New Hampshire is costing small boat fishermen as much as $700 a day, and it's just not sustainable. So in 2016, NOAA agreed to pay 85% of that cost, but in 2017, unless we do something about it, that cost is going to shift back to our fishers unless another agreement is reached. So how would you approach negotiations with small businesses and industries in this and other situations similar to this?
Well, as we discussed, it's really a question of how can we set up the least expensive mechanism for assuring that people are adhering to the rules.
Yeah.
And usually, putting in technological devices is a net saver of costs. It sounds in this particular case like it's the reverse. So I would look forward to researching that and trying to figure out how do we accomplish the necessary objective of enforcement without putting undue hardship on the small boat fishermen.
Thank you very much. And again, thank you for being here this morning.
Thank you, Senator Hassan. Senator Udall has returned. He's up next, and I have Senator Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Ross, I want to welcome you today and thank you for your willingness to serve. I appreciated meeting with you in my office earlier this month, and you have an extensive business background that spans numerous industries. This experience should prove useful to you at the Department of Commerce, where you will lead a diverse collection of agencies. Commerce does everything from forecasting the weather to managing federal use of wireless spectrum. But the common thread is promoting job creation, economic development, sustainable development, and improved standards of living for Americans. So I certainly want to work with you to ensure that the Commerce Department meets those goals in my home state of New Mexico. I'd like to follow up today on some of what we've discussed in my office earlier this month. First, Mr. Ross, you are reportedly going to be taking a big role in renegotiating trade agreements and international trade policy. The President-elect and his family have a wide variety of assets around the world that other countries could seek to use as leverage with the U.S. in negotiations. If confirmed as Secretary of Commerce, you are committed to divesting your assets, a major undertaking. Would it make your job negotiating international trade issues easier if the President-elect did as you are doing and divested his financial holdings to avoid any complications?
I made the decision that I did because I thought and agreed with the OGE that this was the right thing for me to do. As I understand it, the rules are different as they apply to the President, and I think it's for him to judge what is the appropriate disposition or non-disposition of his assets. I'm not intimate enough with the details of his holdings to even have a clear understanding of just how extensive they are, although I know they're quite huge. So I think that's really a personal decision that he'll have to make.
Mr. Ross, but you understand he's in many countries, the Trump organizations all over the world, and this could raise some real conflicts for you in terms of doing your job. Will you commit that you will notify this committee if another country offers incentives or threatens consequences to the Trump family or Trump organization assets in the course of your international trade negotiations and efforts to promote exports?
Well, anything that interferes with my job is something that I will have very little tolerance for if I'm confirmed. That I can assure you of.
And will you commit to report to this committee? It's kind of a yes or no answer. If another country offers incentives or threatens consequences to the Trump family or the Trump organization assets in the course of doing your job and working on trade?
Well, certainly if they threaten me, I would be able to make people aware of it. But if the hypothetical that you're posing might very well be something I'm not even aware of. So that would make it very difficult to inform anyone of anything.
Well, I'm talking about if in the course of doing your job and working on trade negotiations, somebody comes to you with either a threat or incentive that involves the Trump organization, would you let us at this committee know that that was happening?
Well, I'll tell you two things. I know the president-elect quite well, and I think people who threaten him or offer inappropriate things will find he doesn't take that very lightly. There will be a very strong response on his part, quite independently of anything I would do.
Well, I'm urging you to try to let us know if that situation comes up, because I think it's very important in terms of the objectives of your department to make sure we keep those conflicts out. Now, Mr. Ross, Democrats understand a lot of the frustration about trade that President-elect Trump campaigned on. During my time in Congress, I've supported some trade agreements and opposed others that I believed hurt American workers and chip away at environmental protections. For example, I voted against permanent normalized trade relations with China, and more recently came out in opposition to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. My question really is in using the TPA to pass trade deals without amendment from Congress, will the Trump administration use TPA to pass trade deals without amendment from Congress, which really cuts our constituents out of this and cuts Congress out?
Well, that is certainly a decision the president would have to make. If confirmed, I don't believe I would have the unilateral power to make that decision. That's something that would be at the presidential level, and I'm sure he would take into account whatever considerations he could under the prevailing facts at that particular point in time.
Do you personally support the use of TPA for trade deals?
I think you need to assure your counterparty that there's a reasonable and quick process for solving the negotiations. So far, TPA is the law of the land, and until there's some specific alternative proposed, I don't think there is any real alternative to it.
Thank you for your courtesy. Sorry, Mr. Chairman, for running over a little bit there.
Thank you, Senator Udall. Senator Lee is up next.
Thank you, Chairman Thune, and thank you, Mr. Ross, for being here today. Look forward to our conversation. I've enjoyed hearing your responses to questions asked by my colleagues. And I enjoyed meeting with you last week as well. Throughout the 2016 election cycle, we heard a lot from President Trump about our country's approach to international trade and about the fact that international trade generally and particular international trade agreements have culminated in things that Mr. Trump insisted were negative consequences to American workers and to the economy. He stated that he would have the Secretary of Commerce, the person holding the seat that we're now considering you for, and that you will hold if you're confirmed, along with the U.S. Trade Representative, to, quote, identify all foreign trading abuses that unfairly impact American workers and direct them to use every tool under American and international law to end those abuses immediately. I certainly believe that our country should not accept any trade deal or any practice under any trade deal that unfairly harms Americans. And for similar reasons, I also think that we should be cognizant of the fact that any action we take in retaliation, whether through retaliatory tariffs or otherwise, can also bring about a set of circumstances that could be adverse to the American people, some unpleasant consequences. There are some risks that have to be taken into account, where you have to wonder whether in some cases the medicine might be worse than the underlying ailment for which the medicine was administered. So I would ask you, if you're confirmed to this position, as you're considering in that position a particular trade deal or a particular action to be taken relative to trade, will you take into account the potential retaliation on American consumers and American supply chains, what spillover consequences these might have, and take those into account in making the decision?
Well, surely, having been part of those supply chains, I have some fair understanding as to how they work and how they're essential. But on the topic of retaliation, my mindset will be that of a world's largest customer dealing with his vendors. I view these other countries with whom we have trade deficits as our vendors. And while you need to treat the vendors with respect, they must also treat you as their largest customer, both with respect and, more importantly, playing by the rules of the road. And to the degree they don't, it must be enforcement, because we are a country of the rule of law. Some of these other countries are instead the law of the ruler. That's an asymmetry that permeates all kinds of sectors of their economies and ours, and we need to deal with that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your commitment to that. The rule of law absolutely is important. It's been a key part of why our economy has been so successful, and a key part of what makes us competitive in the global marketplace. And I appreciate your willingness to consider those potential spillover effects. As you know, Article 1, Section 8, the very first clause of Article 1, Section 8, where most of Congress's powers are outlined, gives Congress the power to set tax rates, among other things, to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. And the third clause of that same section also gives Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and between the states. Do you believe that Congress should have a role in determining trade policy? And will you commit to work with us and to consult with us before taking any action on your own?
Well, I certainly believe it has to be an interactive process between Congress and each of the departments, and I see no reason that I would deviate from that practice.
In the final seconds I have, just want to note, I appreciate your willingness to look at spectrum, to take a look at the spectrum that the federal government currently holds, and to look at areas where we might be able to release some of that federally held spectrum. That'll help us address some real significant needs that we have in rural states, and states like mine, like the state of Utah, where we could benefit from it. I see my time's expired. Thank you, Mr. Ross. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Lee, and ditto on the spectrum issue. Next up is Senator Young.
Thank you, Chairman. And Mr. Ross, thanks for your interest in serving here in this capacity. I enjoyed our visit some days ago, and I'd like to begin by asking you a question about the steel industry. In my state of Indiana, the steel industry employs directly roughly 25,000 Hoosiers. And I routinely hear from those individuals, their families, members of their community, that they have concerns about the market-distorting practices from the Chinese government, something that may have come up earlier today in the midst of my other two confirmation hearings. This overcapacity issue that threatens numerous Hoosier manufacturing jobs is one that has really come to the fore over the last 8 years. And the incoming administration has routinely pledged to fight very hard on behalf of American workers. They've indicated the Department of Commerce would have an expanded role in advocating on behalf of fair trade practices. Could you please elaborate on your plans to push back against unfair trade practices from China and other steel dumping countries?
Yeah, I'm glad you point out that it isn't just China. And part of my feeling is that China is the largest, but by no means the only problem in that regard. There is a global problem of overcapacity, but it's mainly focused in China. And an interesting fact in terms of the question of government subsidy, there are some of the state-owned enterprises, something like a third of them, have never made a profit. They're being kept alive by the state-owned banks. To me, that looks and feels and tastes a lot like artificial subsidy. So I think we need to be very sophisticated in the way we look at the forms of subsidy. It isn't just things like VAT, and it isn't just things like that. It's all kinds of intricate corporate relationships, many of which have not really been attacked before. I think we will be very scrupulous, if I'm confirmed, at dealing with those issues.
Well, that's very encouraging. We don't want to jump to conclusions too quickly. One is very quick. When prices rise, to charge monopolistic pricing. When prices are the same level, roughly, they charge parallel pricing. And when a competitor has undercuts us, we often say that dumping is going on. So we want to make certain that we are sure that's what's occurring, but at the same time, we want to act, and we want to act boldly, and I hear your commitment to do that here today. Indiana is home to many auto manufacturers that have global supply chains, something that was just invoked. For example, GM's assembly in Roanoke employs nearly 4,000 Hoosiers. Subaru in Lafayette employs 5,000. Toyota in Princeton, roughly 4,500 Hoosiers. Then we have a whole distinct recreational vehicle industry up near Elkhart. So these jobs provide Hoosiers with a secure middle-class income at a time when a lot of people are anxious about their ability to land those jobs and to keep them. Can you reassure the tens of thousands of Hoosiers, auto workers and others, whose jobs rely on free trade, that their livelihoods will not be put at risk by restrictive tariffs which might interrupt these global supply chains?
Well, as I've said quite often publicly, I think the best way to deal with the trade deficit is increased exports. I think that's the number one priority. Number two is to get the Toyotas and other companies like that to build their factories here so that workers do have not only continued employment but enhanced employment. And I think with the right tax policies, regulatory policies, and other policies, we can accomplish that.
But it's your goal with respect to tariff policies as you consult with others in the administration for there to be no interruption to those Hoosiers, tens of thousands who are currently employed in the auto industry and other industries who rely upon global supply chains.
Well, I well understand that. Having been part of it,
yes,
I very well understand it. Tariffs do have a useful role. They do have a useful role in correcting inappropriate practices. They also do have a useful role as a negotiating tool. I'm keenly aware of Smoot-Hawley and the effect that it had on trade in general and our trade in particular. And if there's nothing else, we can learn from history that that kind of approach didn't work very well. And it didn't work very well then, and it very likely wouldn't work very well now.
I'm encouraged that those historical lessons will inform your practices as the next head of the agency. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Young. Senator Duckworth is up next. Are you ready, Senator, or would you like us to?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We had some microphone issues. Oh, there we go. Mr. Ross, congratulations on your nomination, and thank you so much for visiting with me last week to discuss the issues that's so important to Illinois workers and our economy. When we met last week, I think we had common cause and our shared conviction that rule breakers should be held accountable. And if those rules are set by the international trading system, then we should exercise our rights to enforce those rules and penalize the rule breakers. And we talked at length about the impact illegal steel dumping has had on our nation's economy, and particularly in Illinois, where it has contributed to over 2,000 Granite City steel workers getting laid off through no fault of their own, just days after Christmas a couple years ago. I've been pushing for stronger enforcements against violation of trade laws that make it difficult for American manufacturers, including steel, to compete. Will you work with me to crack down on currency manipulation?
Yes, I think currency manipulation is just another device, another non-tariff barrier that countries use to attack our economy.
How would the Commerce Department plan to make enforcement of trade laws a priority? And here I'm talking about timely enforcement before workers have lost their jobs. You and I spoke a little bit, and I told you the story of U.S. Steel in Illinois, where because of illegal dumping of foreign steel, they had to cut down production, laid off all of those workers. But the steel company itself that was going into bankruptcy had to take on the responsibility of bringing the case to the international court system. And that is, I feel, an unfair burden on these companies that are already suffering from the currency manipulation, the dumping of products by competitors. At the same time, their competitors abroad don't have to take on that burden. Can you speak a little bit more to this process?
Yes, as we discussed, Senator, I like the idea of occasionally using self-initiation by the Department of Commerce to bring these cases. That will shorten the duration of the preparatory time, and if we're also stricter about not granting extensions to the perpetrators. Historically, the people who've been the dumpers refused to comply on a timely basis with requests for information. I'm not going to look, if confirmed, I would not look very kindly on the perpetrators deliberately delaying cases by not providing information.
You had mentioned the potential in our meeting for having a special liaison in your office, or someone who would work to be the point person, and you can correct my phrasing, for bringing forth these cases when American industry is being unfairly burdened, so that it's not on the shoulders of U.S. Steel to bring the case to the international court system, but that they have someone in commerce who's already looking out and able to be that point person. And can you talk about how you would set up that, I don't know, it's a person, an office, what the relationship would be to you as secretary?
Right. Well, first of all, we're not going to self-initiate every case. We don't have the staffing to do it. But I think by picking strategic cases and initiating them, it will, A, send a message to the people on the other side that we're getting more serious about this. Second, it would definitely accelerate the process, and therefore I'll figure out some way, if confirmed, to allocate people power to that activity. It will be a much more important activity if I'm Secretary of Commerce than it had been historically.
Thank you. I think for the families of those steel workers, time is of the essence. They're the ones who are missing mortgage payments. They're the ones who now have to tell their children, you can't go back to college because we can't afford tuition. They're the ones who are about to lose their homes. So anything that we can do to speed up that process for any of America's industry, not just the steel workers. I'd like to shift a little bit and talk about the Minority Business Development Agency. What new support will you give the MBDA to answer the growing call for a larger footprint of services so more minority businesses can grow through M&A and high-tech opportunities?
Well, I think it's an essential thing because those are some of the industries of the future. I think what we will need to do is to find people who have the technological capabilities. And as you and I discussed, one of the problems is our educational system is stinting on STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math courses, and we're also stinting on vocational training. So one of the problems is there's a lack, particularly in some of the minority communities, of the capabilities to do that, and that's a very serious problem. We can hope to cope with some of that with apprenticeship programs. We as a country are the worst in the OECD on having apprenticeship programs. We're also the worst on having vocational training. So I think we have to have an overall approach to solving the problem of making sure that people are qualified to do the technological innovation.
Thank you. And if there's a second round of questions, I would definitely be asking about what are you going to do for existing minority-owned businesses today? I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank
Well,
you.
the entity within Commerce, I have been told, has done a pretty good job. I hear reports that people are pretty satisfied with what it's been doing, but there's always more that you can do to be more aggressive in helping. So I will work with the staff of the MBDA to try to figure out how we can most sensibly expand those activities.
Thank you, Senator Duckworth. Mr. Ross, I would defer to you on this in terms of when, if you would like a break. We have a number of members to get to in the first round and a couple who would like to ask questions in a second round. So I assume at some point you would want to take a break, but whenever that point occurs.
I could go another 10 minutes, sir.
Okay, we'll take, we have in order right now Senator Booker and Senator Fisher.
Mr. Chairman, as always, I defer to Senator Fisher on anything. So if she would like to go first, I can go second. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Ross, it's very good to see you. Thank you very much for taking time to come and sit with me. I know it's an expected gesture, but it meant a lot to me, and I appreciated our conversation. I want to start with the first issue I started with when you came to my office, and that's the issue of infrastructure. In last week's hearing with the Secretary of Transportation nominee Chow, she told me that she believes that President-elect Trump's $1 trillion infrastructure package will include direct federal spending. Well, I know you and I talked about the totality of the picture in my office. The report that you co-authored for the campaign really only talked about tax breaks to private investors. You and I both know there are many ways to invest in projects, especially those, as we discussed, that don't have a clear, obvious revenue stream, especially those that often affect people in rural areas, people in poor communities, people that often need critical infrastructure to live healthy lives, to be able to pursue happiness, life, and their liberty. Your report says, rightfully, that there are about 2,000 additional water systems with excessive levels of contamination, including those that serve our schools and daycare centers. Do you agree that repairing and rebuilding water infrastructures in places like Flint and Newark, where residents cannot afford utility rates, requires direct federal spending, especially given the consequences to the development of children who have elevated blood lead levels, which not lead poisoning, but just elevated blood lead levels, is directly correlated to poor performance in school, a lack of executive function it has to the most important economic agents in our nation. Lead itself undermines their success and contributions in the economic marketplace.
Well, those situations, it seems to me, are a matter of public policy, and that will take cooperation between the Congress and the President to solve. The infrastructure paper that I put out, as you know, Senator, was meant to provide another tool, not to be the be-all and end-all. And I certainly think there's a role for the federal government to play, just as there is for state and local government to play in dealing with some of these critical infrastructure needs of communities.
So I appreciate that. And just succinctly, then, you support direct spending by government on infrastructure?
I think there will be some necessity for it, whether it's in the form of guarantees or direct investment or whatever, but it's really for the Congress and the President to figure out what should be the quantity of it and what should be the nature of the projects.
But as a person with vast sort of business experience, understanding how balance sheets works, if people who are concerned about debt to GDP ratio, investments in infrastructure, especially in the region that you and I both know best, you might call it the greater New York metropolitan area, I call it the greater Newark metropolitan area, you understand that investing in infrastructure produces $2 to $3 of return in economic growth, and that could be a wise business investment to do direct government expenditures, yes?
Well, as you know, I think that the labor content and the profit content of infrastructure construction can go a long way toward offsetting tax revenues that aren't there, because labor content is around 44% in an infrastructure project. So if you allow for the wages on that and you allow for taxes on the profit of the contractor, you have something coming back in.
I appreciate it. It could be really economically stimulative, correct?
Yes.
Yes, sir. And so I also understand that the President-elect's team is putting together a list of specific high-priority infrastructure projects from around the country that they plan to seek funding for. What's the criteria for those projects to be included on the list? And will that list be shared soon? And do you and the President-elect Trump plan on requesting direct federal spending for those high-priority projects?
Well, I don't think the list has been refined as yet. You probably saw in the media recently, he's appointed a business partner of mine, Richard Lafrac, and Steve Roth to head up the infrastructure consulting project. So I think they will play a big role in helping him determine what are the key projects and how to implement them.
And not just because you're a young man born and raised in New Jersey, and Mr. Lafrac is obviously from New Jersey as well, but you understand that the busiest river crossing in all of North America is the Hudson River crossing, that is a choke point for our nation in a region of the globe that is probably one of the most economically productive regions on the globe. And the fact that that infrastructure is failing now, that it is critical that we open up those arteries like a stint on the Northeast Corridor where more people travel by rail than travel by air. You understand the urgency of that project given the role of this region in the GDP of our country.
I surely do, Senator. You and I have probably made that crossing more often than anybody else in this room.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Booker. Next up, Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Ross, for your willingness to serve this country in the position of Secretary of Commerce. As you know, the Department of Commerce has put a lot of work into thinking of ways to encourage the growth of the Internet of Things, and I commend the Department for those efforts. Senators Booker and Gardner and Schatz and myself, we recently reintroduced the Digit Act, which would create a working group convened by the Department of Commerce to make recommendations to Congress on ways to advance the Internet of Things. As Secretary, would you plan to continue the Department's efforts to collaborate with both private stakeholders and other government entities, including Congress, to encourage the development of the Internet of Things?
Well, I think all aspects of Internet need encouragement. There are issues, technical issues, privacy issues, and such as that come up. So it's not a simple subject. But when President-elect Trump convened the meeting of the high-tech CEOs some weeks ago, he was kind enough to have me be very much involved with that. And I was impressed with how willing the high-tech people were to work with the new administration to try to deal with these kinds of issues, even though, as it happens during the campaign, we were not necessarily the recipient of much support from them. So I think that was a very good thing, and some of those leaders have followed up with me subsequently with some more specific suggestions. So I look forward to a constructive relationship in that series of areas.
That's good to hear. As you know, the Internet of Things, when we look at all that can be created and the innovation that takes place and really the business growth for entrepreneurs, it's going to be a huge area for growth in this sector, and one that I've enjoyed working with on a bipartisan basis with members of this committee. We also discussed during our meeting that agriculture is the economic engine of the state of Nebraska. In fact, cattle outnumber people 4-1 in our state, and Nebraskans work very hard to produce food, fiber, and fuel for the rest of the world. In 2015, Nebraska's agricultural exports amounted to roughly $6.4 billion, and of that, our delicious Nebraska beef exports accounted for about $1 billion. And that is why access to global markets is really extremely important to my constituents, all the people of Nebraska. If confirmed, what approach do you believe that you will take to ensure that we have those global market opportunities and that they are available for industries like Nebraska where we can continue to grow and develop.
Well, agriculture certainly is one of the industries where we remain the world leader in technology and in execution. So it's one of the very strong points of our economy. Second of all, many of the other countries, our trading partners, literally cannot feed themselves. So they're going to have to buy food from somewhere outside. Take China, for example. Only 13% of that huge land mass is arable because so much of it is desert, so much is mountainous, so much is just not farmable. So there are some structural disadvantages that many of our trading partners have where they very much need us. I think that is actually not something to be feared in those negotiations. I think it's one of our strengths.
Yes,
China's
obviously.
soybeans basically come from two places, U.S. and Brazil. I don't know where they would get the soybeans if somehow they tried to cut us off.
Right. Thank you. There was some talk earlier about federally held spectrum, which the NTIA has a very important role in making more spectrum available for commercial use, which I think is a laudable goal. I'm also a member of the Senate's Armed Services Committee, and as such, I believe it is also very important that the agencies that are responsible for protecting the homeland have the spectrum that they need to do that. As Secretary of Commerce, how would you approach the task of balancing the commercial sector's need for additional spectrum while still obviously recognizing but also putting as a priority the importance of our national security and making sure we have the spectrum needed to defend this country?
Well, for sure, the vast majority of the federally occupied spectrum that's unused now is in the hands of the Department of Defense. So first objective has to be do no harm. We can't compromise national defense, homeland security at all. But we also need to be rational, and it can't be that there's hoarding. And I think one of the tricky problems is how do you incentivize any department that has the spectrum to give it up? I think that's the trickiest part, is how to motivate them to do so, and that's something we should all give some thought to.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Fisher. How are we doing? Mr. Ross, would you like to?
This would be an opportune
Okay.
moment, sir.
All right, good. Well, let's take a quick 10 minutes and reconvene as quickly as possible so we can keep plowing on. So thank you, and we will briefly recess.
Thank you, Chairman. Oh, how are you?
Oh, it went really well. It's in a
All right, we're back. We'll pick up where we left off and start with Senator Cruz for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ross, congratulations to you and your family on this nomination. I think you're going to do a terrific job, and I look forward to this committee working closely with you. I'll tell you one of the things I'm most excited about. You and I had an opportunity to visit at length, and your commitment to regulatory reform, to working to reduce the burdens of Washington on small businesses and job creators, I think is critically important, and I think it is shared by cabinet appointees throughout this administration, and that is one aspect that is going to have among the most dramatic impacts on bringing back jobs, expanding the number of high-paying jobs, and raising wages across the country. And so I commend you for that. I want to talk about a number of specific areas. I want to start with addressing spectrum, which, as you know, has been a long-time interest of this committee. And the demand for spectrum continues growing at remarkable levels. Indeed, U.S. mobile data doubled usage from 2012 to 2013, and it's projected to increase by 650% by 2018. And spectrum is always scarce, but that's exacerbated by the fact that the federal government owns or shares roughly half of the spectrum. And that presents both a challenge and an opportunity. It is a challenge in that government agencies have been notoriously reluctant to give up or share any of the spectrum that they have control of. It is an opportunity in that it provides the potential for billions of dollars of revenue to the federal government, while at the same time opening up new spectrum that can create millions of high-paying jobs and increase wages across the country. So I wanted to ask you, I think there is room for a lot of creative policy making, working with your fellow cabinet members who have control of spectrum to find a way to incentivize those agencies to work to make more spectrum available for the public and have it be a win-win all around. And I wanted to ask you to comment on that, and in particular for your commitment to work with me and work with this committee to explore significantly increasing the bandwidth and spectrum that's available to the public and the revenue accordingly that would be available to the federal government. You need to turn your microphone on, sir.
I think it's absolutely essential, Senator, that we do that. I think the tricky part is the one that you and I discussed at some length, which is how do you incentivize other agencies to give up the spectrum that perhaps they don't really need. I think there's a natural tendency for everyone to want to keep on to things in case they need it. So I think the tricky thing, which probably would involve public policy questions for the Congress, would be how do you provide some sort of an incentive? If there's something that commerce itself can do, if confirmed, I will do my best to put that into effect, but I don't see anything immediately obvious as a solution that Congress itself could do.
Well, I look forward to our working together and to solve that together creatively. Let me shift to a different topic, which is there has been growing concern about China making acquisitions in the United States and, among other things, gaining significant influence in the U.S. movie industry, making major acquisitions, potentially creating an environment where entertainment companies in the United States engage in self-censorship because of foreign ownership. That concerns all of us who care about free speech and do not want to see speech censored by other nations. Do you share those concerns, and what steps do you see potentially that we could take to mitigate those concerns?
I thank the Senator for that question. I think it's one of the most important questions facing us right now. And it's not just food. Food is certainly an element of national security by any measure, but it's also little high-tech companies. They're making a lot of venture capital investments, and maybe the dollars aren't so significant, but the technology potentially is. And in areas like semiconductor, I'm very, very concerned about that, because they are the world's largest, the Chinese are the world's largest consumer of semiconductors. So far are mainly importing it a lot from here. And semiconductors are a basic building block. Second, when President-elect Trump convened the high-tech CEOs a few weeks ago, I was struck to learn from them that the closer they get to content, the more constrictive the Chinese are on their activities. So it seems not very reciprocal that they want to control entertainment and other media here, and yet are denying our companies anything getting remotely close to that. So there isn't even a balance, and that's a separate problem that's characteristic of a lot of the relationships with them.
I look forward to working with you on that issue. My time has expired, but let me briefly ask a final question, which is this committee has expressed considerable concern over the decision of the prior administration to transfer control of ICANN, the basic infrastructure of the Internet, to a consortium of foreign countries, including countries like Russia and China and Iran. Do you share those concerns, and will you commit to working with this committee to ensure that we protect free speech on the Internet and that we do not allow enemies of free speech to exercise authority that restricts our freedoms here in America?
Yes, as such a big market, and really as the inventors of the Internet, I'm a little surprised that we seem to be essentially voiceless in the governance of that activity. That strikes me as an intellectually incorrect solution, but I'm not aware of what it is that we actually can do right now to deal with that. It exists. If some realistic alternative comes up, I'd be very interested to help explore it.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. Senator Baldwin is up next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Ross, it's good to see you again. I appreciate your coming by my office last week to discuss various trade issues, and that's where I want to start. You authored the Trump trade doctrine, And it's something I think I shared with you. At first glance, I agree with substantial parts of it. Like you and President-elect Trump, I believe that we need a new approach to trade. And I hope that we can, in fact, work together on creating a new trade agenda that increases wages, creates jobs, and cracks down on cheating from countries like China, and strengthens the manufacturing sector in our country and in states like Wisconsin. I hope that we can work together to achieve these goals in the years ahead. While trade has gained a lot of national attention recently, it's really been on the top of my mind for many years, and certainly my constituents too. Given that we share some of the trade priorities, I'd like to take the opportunity of this Q&A to drill down a bit further into some of your plans to ensure that they will improve economic opportunities of Wisconsinites who have really borne the brunt of some bad trade deals very directly. Mr. Ross, you and the President-elect have spoken often about your desire to renegotiate one of our nation's trade agreements, NAFTA. I, too, have concerns with that agreement, most notably its prohibition of Buy America programs. The procurement chapter of that agreement allows Mexican and Canadian companies to bid for American taxpayer-financed projects as domestic companies. Can you commit to eliminating the procurement chapter in NAFTA?
I think all aspects of NAFTA would be put on the table, and that certainly is going to be a topic that would come up. But you don't have a deal on anything until you have a deal on everything. So exactly what would come in a final treaty or not is a little bit premature to say, but I'm certainly aware of the issue and certainly aware of the President-elect's view about Buy America.
Let me ask it then in a slightly different way, understanding the complexities of renegotiating a multilateral trade agreement. Going forward, do you believe that our trade agreements should allow foreign companies to bid as American companies for taxpayer-funded projects?
I think it's a highly questionable practice, and I think that it is one that has to be done with extreme care. There are probably some few segments where there may be a technology that someone has that we can't avail ourselves of. There may be some circumstances where it's totally appropriate, but many countries have the equivalent of Buy America, so that's not an unusual factor. And the Chinese, most of all, have very good in the sense of strong policies. And I think that there should be a reciprocity, and at least if American companies can't bid on projects there, doesn't strike me as very logical that their companies should be able to bid on projects here. Reciprocity seems to me is a fundamental principle even of the WTO, and it's one that's mostly honored in the breach by some of our major trading partners.
In the Trump economic plan, you discuss the outsourcing phenomenon as caused by both a push of burdensome American regulations and the pull from foreign countries who do not have our labor or environmental standards. You've also been critical of the Obama administration and their actions to prevent climate change and to protect labor rights domestically. In order to level the playing field as you propose, will you commit to holding our trading partners to higher standards or only to lowering ours?
Well, the existing trade agreements have very, very weak enforcement in general, and particularly weak enforcement on environmental and labor. Take Mexico, for example. The minimum wage in Mexico has barely changed in pesos for quite a few years, and the peso has depreciated quite a lot against the dollar. So on a purchasing power basis, the average Mexican worker is far worse off than he or she was 5 or 10 years ago. That was not the original intent of NAFTA. One of the original intents was to bring up the standard of living there, bring up the labor conditions there, make them a little bit more stable and more prosperous economy, and frankly reduce the gap in productivity adjusted wages between the two countries. It hasn't worked that way, and that has to be, or if I'm confirmed, will be a very serious topic for consideration.
Thank you, Senator Baldwin. Senator Moran.
Mr. Ross, thank you very much for your interest in public service and your care for Americans and their jobs. Let me first just to associate myself with what the senator from Mississippi, Senator Wicker, indicated to you and the conversation that we had in my office. I would add to his voice that an infrastructure program needs to include broadband expansion, particularly in rural and unserved areas. And so Mr. Wicker raised that topic with you. I won't spend any more time on it. I wanted to talk a bit about spectrum, wireless. First of all, Senator Udall and I have worked on legislation that was included in the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2015. It provided more funding and flexibility for federal agencies to use the Spectrum Reallocation Fund for research and development related to their spectrum activities. It was our intention that this additional funding and flexibility would result in a more efficient use of spectrum by federal users and free up more government spectrum for commercial use. OMB oversees that fund, but it does so in consultation with the National Telecommunications and Information Administration that's part of the Department of Commerce. I'd like to have you assure me that the SRF will be utilized to achieve those goals in your administration of the Department of Commerce. And as a follow-on, I would indicate to you, in following the senator from Nebraska's commentary about the use of spectrum, there's a 2011 GAO report that basically said that NTIA needed to improve its spectrum management policies to promote more efficient use of federal spectrum. And the way I read that, I think it bluntly indicated that NTIA oversees, while it oversees the spectrum, it is often pushed around by bigger federal agencies and departments, and therefore it's difficult to get those agencies and departments who have little incentive to cooperate, to give up their valuable spectrum. And I would ask you what can be done at NTIA to get this to work better than it does today.
Well, I don't intend to be pushed around by anyone.
I like the answer. It also allows me to ask an additional question. We've taken a special interest in the efficiency of IT procurement, and you indicated in your testimony that it's an area of that you have interest in. Senator Udall again and I introduced an act we call Move It. It later evolved into a legislation that is designed to better accommodate agencies who seek to update their IT systems, but they're unable to do so in their current budget framework. I again would ask you to commit toward attention toward modernizing the Department of Commerce and its IT infrastructure, particularly its legacy IT. And do you believe that the federal government can better leverage commercial cloud-based solutions to save money and increase security?
Well, I'm a very big proponent of cloud. We've used it a lot in private sector. And as far as we can tell, it is not only more efficient, it's probably also more secure for lots of very complicated technical reasons. I think that it's a very important thing for government to do, and also to have systems that talk to each other. There's an awful lot of siloing, both within commerce and outside of commerce, and I think that is not a very satisfactory end result. We need to all be on similar quality and efficiency of communication. I think the tricky part of it is, where do you get the funding to make the changeover? Because there are some one-time costs to doing these. Commerce already has several initiatives underway, and I'm certainly encouraged by what I've learned about those, and I think much more could be done.
Mr. Ross, thank you. I would indicate that too many times the headline issues that we can deal with are left, they overcome the good government issues that are so desperately need attention. Let me finally say that, as I indicated in my office, that trade is an important, exports is an important matter to Kansans. Manufacturing of airplanes sold around the globe, agriculture commodities, I would highlight that for you. But I also would point out the view that China recently increased its anti-dumping duties and its anti-subsidy tariffs on U.S. dried distillers grain. The decision came just days after the Chinese government decided to increase tariffs on U.S. ethanol from 5% to 30%. Kansas farmers also continued to be held back by China's refusal to approve new varieties of biotech corn, which happened in 2014. I supported a WTO case brought challenging China's domestic support of rice, corn, and wheat. My point is that too often we negotiate trade agreements, and they are designed to level the playing field in regard to tariffs, that in all the other issues that a country can bring to play, we high-five ourselves with the satisfaction of reaching a trade agreement, but then we miss the point of defending and fighting the other things that prevent our products from getting into other countries. And it seems compatible with what you've been testifying.
Oh, it is. I've been a victim over the years of some of these non-tariff trade barriers, and they're quite insidious, but also, unfortunately, they can be quite effective. We need to deal with those. It's not enough to have a trade agreement that just hits tariffs. And it's one of the reasons I think there should be systematic reopeners of trade agreements after a few-year period, because it's hard to anticipate the ingenuity that some of these folks have to get around the intent of the agreement. So I think an automatic reopener, whether it's a sunset provision or just a reopener, would be a very useful thing to look back on what was originally contemplated, look back on what was originally projected to occur, and to say, well, if we didn't achieve those objectives, why not, and what do we need to do to fix them? I think an agreement like NAFTA is more than 40 years old, and there's never been a systematic, transparent review of it.
Mr. Ross, if you're confirmed, I intend to be gum on your shoe in regard to the exports of agricultural products and commodities from Kansas and manufactured airplanes and the other things we do in the global economy.
I got that impression the other day, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Senator Moran. He's gum on our shoe a lot, too. So we've been, just to that point, we've been victims, my state has, our agricultural producers, particularly bee producers, of this gaming. We call it honey laundering, which is something that the Chinese have been particularly effective at, and we do need to enforce our laws and make sure that people are playing by the rules. So, very important issue to a lot of people on this committee. Senator Capito.
Thank you. Good afternoon now, Mr. Ross, and thank you as well for joining me in my office last week. I enjoyed our conversation, and I just wanted to kind of reiterate a few of the issues that you and I talked about, and no surprise here for you in terms of what's important to the state of West Virginia. We talked about the transitioning of our state from a coal economy, hopefully, to a more high-tech, keeping our coal economy going, but also trying to diversify. And one of the administrations under the Department of Commerce is the EDA. Recently, the EDA has taken a renewed interest, thank goodness, at my and other people's urging, to really look at the severe job loss in our regions and to use those dollars to maximize the effect of entrepreneurship, capacity building, and other ways for us to diversify our economy, whether it's agriculture, high-tech, energy sector jobs. And so I would just like to reiterate to you, since the last 2 years we've made good strides here, that this is important, even though it's not a large agency in terms of appropriation, it does and can have a far-reaching effect in the distressed areas in our country where I'm living and where many of us are. So I would just like to reiterate my commitment and hopefully your commitment to work together to see that the EDA continues the progress we've made over the last several years.
Yes, I think EDA can be a very valuable source of seed money for projects and kind of matching things, triggering other sources of economic help to get things jump-started. I think that, given its budgetary constraints, that's probably the most that it can do, but I think that can be a very valuable function if properly applied.
It absolutely can, and in some of the rural areas where we have trouble attracting capital and attracting investment, it can be first in or last in and have some complete projects at the same time. So I don't want you to think that you're in an echo chamber, but I am going to talk a bit about rural broadband, which we discussed. I was really pleased to learn, and you told me that day, but you reiterated in your remarks that you have some direct experience with broadband deployment in the state of Florida. A little bit different terrain than the state of West Virginia, that's for sure, but the rural areas are really behind here. And again, if we're transitioning or if we're going to go to the next economy, if we don't have that stool of infrastructure development, we're going to be further behind. Secretary Chow was here last week. I reiterated to her how important I think an infrastructure package has to include broadband deployment in the underserved and unserved areas. And since you have experience in this issue, I'm sure that you can see what it can do to the development of areas that have been undeveloped and what it can do for healthcare, education, and other aspects of people's quality of life. So I look forward to working with you in this area and learning from you on the best ways to get to that broader and bigger elimination of the digital divide that exists.
Thank you very much, Senator.
Lastly, I mentioned to you that, and I was glad to see in your remarks you talked about NOAA and how important it is from the aspect of living in Florida. NOAA has a large and significant presence in West Virginia, and I think I can reasonably state it was probably an earmark from Senator Robert C. Byrd. So it's still there and doing well, and it's the primary backup for all of NOAA's emergency contingency operations. It's key to making sure, for instance, the GO-16 satellite that was just launched, this facility serves as the consolidated backup facility for the mission. We've still got capacity to grow here, so we're hoping that NOAA, because I have confidence in our abilities now, will work with us in West Virginia to grow that footprint and use us as the highly technical, skilled folks that we have. And we're growing a technology corridor down through sort of the middle of the state to try to work with that. So I want to work with you with NOAA, and hopefully we can visit those facilities together.
Yes, from everything I've heard, NOAA is quite happy with the relationship they have with the local community there.
Well, good. That's great. The FBI is right down the street, so maybe they have to be happy. Thank you very much for, sorry, I think I might be the last one of the first, no, oh no. I forgot Chairman Inhofe right to my left here. So I appreciate it, and I look forward to working with you at the Department of Commerce, and look forward to voting in the affirmative for your nomination.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Capito. Senator Inhofe is next.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Ross. And I enjoyed, first of all, the visit we had in my office, and I'll make mine a lot quicker than most of them. I do apologize. The reason for all of us being late is that in my case, we have our Oklahoma Attorney General has been nominated to be the director of the EPA, and I have more than just a casual interest in that. And in fact, the last four of the members here are late because they're of that hearing. So this is not the way it should be, I suppose, but it's the best we can do. Let me just mention one thing. Way back when NAFTA was passed, in our delegation of 7 members from Oklahoma, I was the only one who voted against it. And I would just like to be drawn into the loop as you make progress on changes you may want to make, so that we'll be aware of that and can perhaps participate in a small way.
Actually, I believe there is a consultative process provided in the TPA regulations, and that therefore there will be at least that level of consultation.
Good. I talked to you also about Taiwan being the close friend and ally of the United States and our 9th largest trading partner. That's very significant. and we could further strengthen the U.S.-Taiwan relationship by engaging in direct bilateral trade agreements. Now, these negotiations would need to address Taiwan's current ban on importing pork containing ractopamine, a food additive. The chairman of this committee has talked about, is concerned about some of the things that we want to do with Taiwan. So I would say, as Secretary, would you just consider prioritizing the United States trade relationship with Taiwan and consider laying the groundwork for a direct bilateral negotiations?
Well, as you know, that's a very complex issue.
I know it is.
Because of the one China, two China policies. So I think that there we would need some guidance from the President as to what direction he wishes to go.
And that's the very reason I worded it the way I did. Just consider. As I mentioned in my office, you were kind enough to give me quite a bit of time. I've had a very close relationship with Africa. I've actually made 144 African country visits. I am concerned about Africa and our lack of a good relationship that we've had historically. Now, when we did our NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act, I put an amendment on there that we titled the African Free Trade Initiative Act. That was passed. That is now a part of the bill that is going to take care of our NDAA needs for the next year. Now, it's a step in the right direction to partner and secure deeper ties with a fast-growing economy, such as that in sub-Saharan Africa. There are nations eager to engage in direct bilateral negotiations on trade with the United States, and I just would hope that you would work with me to focus U.S. trade efforts in Africa.
It's almost impossible to imagine ignoring such a large continent with such rapid growth to it, with such strategic importance and potentially such economic importance. So clearly there's a role for us to play with Africa. And I think one of the concerns that we should all share is that China has been all over the map in Africa, building high schools, building soccer playing fields, doing all kinds of things, and gobbling up natural resources as well. Nature abhors a vacuum. And to the degree we've let a vacuum be created there, there's a countervailing force that's going to fill it, and that's not us.
That is a beautiful response. I appreciate that very much. I might add, China doesn't even use their labor when they're in these projects. So anyway, I look forward to supporting your confirmation, and thank you very much for being willing to do it.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Inhofe. And I think last up on the first round is Senator Markey. And Senators Inhofe and Capito both left time on the clock. I think that's the first time that's happened today. So we must be winding down. Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Mr. Ross, we're in the world of the Internet of Things. As the Internet is built into the appliances which we use, the machines which we use, the automobiles, the SUVs, everything now is part of the world of the Internet of Things. But, you know, IoT isn't just going to stand for Internet of Things. It's also going to stand for the Internet of Threats to the security, to the privacy of all Americans, as this technology is built into every device. So as we move forward, we have to think at the same time about cybersecurity, about privacy, about what are the protections which we're going to give to Americans so that their privacy and security is not constantly subject to compromise. Could you tell the committee what your views are on that issue and what you would recommend that we do in order to protect Americans?
Well, I've had some direct experience with it. As you know, we've invested in a number of small and medium-sized banks around the country, and even they are subject to cyber attacks from all over the place. Some are just from hackers who simply seem to want to prove that they can do it, but others are evil ones trying to steal people's identities, trying to steal people's money, all kinds of things. So it certainly is a serious problem. And it's the unfortunate flip side of interconnectedness is how do you balance interconnectedness and two-way communication and two-way or multiple-way everything with protecting people. I think we need to be extremely vigilant and keep developing new and better systems, because the people who have bad intent are certainly trying to develop new and better ways to break in. So it's a continuing challenge.
I've introduced legislation which is essentially a cyber labeling program that would just say to industries of the United States, you have to label devices in terms of how secure they are from being hacked, from having privacy compromised. What do you think about that idea? And don't you think on a voluntary basis that is something that we could ask for American industry now to adopt as a practice?
Well, I'm quite sure that American industry is becoming more and more sensitized to the problem. There's no company I know of any size whatsoever that hasn't been having these threats, ranging from electric utilities to every other kind of endeavor. So I think everybody appreciates the problem. Exactly what's the solution and whether one size fits all, I think, is a more complicated issue and one that needs a lot of very thorough investigation.
And I appreciate that. You know, the one problem, of course, is that there are many companies that are never going to invest in cyber security protections, and that is where the problem is going to be created, where the vulnerability is going to be created. So I'm looking forward to working with you on that. Senator Fisher and I have introduced the Federal Spectrum Incentive Act, which offered new incentives for federal agencies to relinquish underutilized spectrum. I know that Senator Cruz just asked about whether we should incentivize federal agencies to vacate or share spectrum they don't need. Will you commit to working with Senator Fisher and I so that we can try to find a way of moving forward legislation that does create those incentives for the federal agencies to free up the spectrum that the private sector could use?
Right. Well, I think it probably would need to be a legislative solution, because it's fairly clear to me that Commerce does not have the power to do it on its own. So to the degree that there's going to be an incentive given, I think it would absolutely have to be legislated.
So, and New Bedford, Massachusetts is the highest grossing fishing port in the United States. What actions would you support to ensure that seafood brought to the market is legally caught and sustainable?
Oh, I think that's very, very important. For one thing, in terms of the domestic catch, clearly the objective should be the maximum sustainable yield. So that as a starting principle. But also, a lot of the imports that come in are produced under conditions that would not be tolerable in the United States. And I think that needs to be dealt with. It needs to be dealt with also at the port level. My understanding is that if a shipment of food comes in that for whatever reason is rejected at a given port, all that happens is then that vessel diverts to another port and hopes to get the same food in. Well, since only 2% of the cargoes are ever inspected, that means they got a 98% chance to get away with it the second time. And meanwhile, the food is a couple of days older and perhaps a couple of days worse conditions. So I think we need to deal with it at a whole series of levels.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Markey. And again, I would echo what's been said about finding more spectrum. We're going to absolutely have to have it. We have 16 billion wireless devices today and headed toward 50 billion by 2020. So it's absolutely essential. Senator Blumenthal, I think, wanted to ask some additional questions.
I have just a few questions. As you know, one aspect of the very broad and varied responsibilities that you would have, if confirmed, pertain to fighting boycotts of American companies that, in effect, refuse to do business with countries Israel is one where action has been taken. Your department has within its authority the Bureau of Industry and Security, which is tasked with prohibiting businesses with a U.S. presence from boycotting those countries like Israel based on foreign laws or at the request of a foreign government. In 2015, I wrote to the Commerce Department, and I was joined by a number of my colleagues, including several on the committee, Senators Booker, Schatz, and Markey. We wrote in response to a number of claims and incidents in which travelers with Israeli passports were denied, and we wrote to the United States Department of Transportation, which agreed that the incidents warranted further inquiry. The Department of Commerce, in effect, deflected our inquiry, providing little information or concern. That raises for me a very important overall issue, standing up to efforts to boycott Israel or any other country in these kinds of business dealings. I'm asking you to commit to make this issue a priority and agree to enforce the anti-boycott laws to the fullest extent of your authority. We're talking about existing laws that need enforcement.
I believe, Senator, that the President-elect has made clear his pro-Israel attitude, and I certainly will do my part to uphold the laws.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you also about cybersecurity, following up on the very helpful comments you've just made. As you well know, this nation is under cyber attack literally every day from the Russians, Chinese, North Koreans. There have been repeated instances of it. In this very room where the Armed Services Committee meets and holds hearings, I'm a member of that committee, we've heard chilling and staggering accounts about the extent and magnitude of cyber warfare. Would you agree that this nation has to develop better policies to deter and punish the Russians and other countries that currently are attacking us literally every day and interfering with our economic system, threatening our economic network, our electronic grid, our transportation system, as well as our military defense?
I absolutely do, Senator Blumenthal. I think to me, the most terrifying form of warfare would be if there was some simultaneous cyber attack on our grid, on the banking system, and on our transportation system. That would be quite a devastating thing, and yet in theory, absent some real protective measures, that could happen.
And we should send the Russians or any other country that would threaten us in that way an unmistakable message that such an attack will be met by an aggressive, effective response.
I think we don't have very much choice because the danger is both large and imminent.
And imminent is also extraordinarily frightening because so much of our nation depends on the interconnection between different sectors of our economy, and our private sector needs to be given impetus to do better.
Yes, and I was either in my discussion with you or perhaps with Senator Markey that we talked about the situation where a fellow had a generator in his house in case the power went off, but the generator was interconnected or was on natural gas, which presumably would also get cut off. So partial prophylactics are not a very good solution in this area. We need things that are quite all-embracing and quite thorough.
Would you agree with me that deterrence against this kind of attack should include measures not only in the cyber domain, but also economic sanctions, if necessary, and foreign exchange sanctions?
Well, I think what we need is an overall coordinated policy to deal with the cyber problem. But it gets into a lot of departments that go well beyond commerce, as you're aware.
But I fully agree, but commerce can play and should play an important role.
I promise you we're on it.
One last question. I will be introducing a measure that would prohibit look-alike toy guns, which can cause tragedies. You may be familiar with the tragedies that have occurred around the country where police in tense situations encounter sometimes young people with look-alike toy guns that they mistake for real weapons, and the result is the police respond by using their weapons, and people may be injured or killed. The measure that I'm going to introduce will strengthen the protections against those kinds of look-alike or toy guns. I am asking for your support because the Secretary of Commerce, along with the Commissioner of Consumer Protection, the CPSC, would have responsibility for developing regulations under this law, asking for your support to ensure that toy, look-alike, or imitation firearms are not allowed to enter commerce unless they are made abundantly clear to be toy guns. Will you commit to supporting such legislation?
I look forward to reading the legislation and discussing it with you, Senator.
Do you agree in principle that this kind of protection is necessary?
Well, I think anything that prevents people from being killed or injured unnecessarily is a good idea, but I'd have to look at the actual draft legislation.
In the course of your investments or other endeavors, have you ever done any work on smart guns?
Smart guns? No, sir. What is that?
Well, guns that may be limited to firing or use if they have the biometric kinds of
yeah, I've heard of it. I've never seen them in action, and so I don't really have a very well-formed opinion of them.
Well, I look forward to talking to you about this topic. I'm out of time, and you've been very patient because you do have jurisdiction over the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, which could play a part in developing standards and technology for smart guns.
Well, developing standards for any innovative process is obviously a very critical function and one that the department takes quite seriously.
I hope you will take this one seriously. I know you will.
I will, Senator.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Senator Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Ross. And I know you heard that a number of us are moving between committees for other confirmation hearings. So if I ask a question that you've already answered, please bear with me. But I very much appreciated your focus and in earlier rounds of questions on economic growth, where you're talking about energy. As you know, in Alaska, we have a lot of it, and we need to produce more of it. And we're very much looking forward to having an executive branch that wants to help us, not stop us from producing energy like we have with the Obama administration, rolling back some of the unnecessary regulations, infrastructure, and then trade. And I think on the issue of trade, I know you've answered a couple questions on it. But as you and I discussed, I believe the Trump administration is going to be the first administration in U.S. history to come into office with trade promotion authority. And a number of us supported that, in part because President Obama got 2 years of it, but we were hoping the next president would be a Republican and would have 4 years of it. That's happened. The administration doesn't have to spend 1 ounce of political capital on getting TPA, and that's usually hard to get over the goal line. So can you just talk a little bit about your views on bilateral trade priorities, but also there have been reports in the press about some kind of 35% tariff. That would seem to me to be about as anti-growth as possible. I know you mentioned in some of your answers Smoot-Hawley, but how are you going to look at the trade element and really take advantage of what's an enormous opportunity, which is TPA that you can use? That's a very, very powerful tool to help American exports.
Well, TPA is an important tool because what it gives is relative assurance to the party with whom you're negotiating that you can deliver. Because any negotiation is handicapped if you're not sure the other guy can deliver on what has been negotiated. So it's a big help in that regard. And there are, as you know, some consultative steps that are required vis-a-vis between the President and the Congress on TPA. And I'm quite sure that if he uses it, the President-elect will adhere to those requirements. So those are good and useful components of the trade process. In terms of the 35% and some of the other statements, I think the President has done a wonderful job preconditioning the other countries with whom we'll be negotiating that change is coming. The peso didn't go down 35% on accident. Even the Canadian dollar has gotten somewhat weaker, also not an accident. So I think he has done some of the work already that we need to do in order to get better trade deals. Because when you start out with the adverse party understanding that he or she is going to have to make concessions, that's a pretty good background for any negotiation to begin. So I'm very grateful that he's made this task a little bit easier by alerting everybody that change is coming.
But would 35% tariffs be pro-growth or not?
Oh, I think that the pro-growth thing is stimulating exports much more than just curtailing imports. But tariffs can be countervailing duties, and punishment to people for dumping is essential because there are inappropriate and illegal trade practices being performed. And if you don't really punish them, you're never going to modify their behaviors. So there's certainly a role for it there.
Let me ask just a related question when you're talking about trade tools, and that's, I know there's been a lot of focus on China. That's in the area of reciprocity. Right. So right now, as you know, there's stories, and it's happening. China has two very large investment funds where they're buying up strategic companies in Western Europe, trying to in the United States. Some are strategic, some are just important. You know, they're looking certainly at the movie industry in Hollywood and chip manufacturers. And yet, I think it's pretty common knowledge that if our companies wanted to go to China and buy up a big movie industry or buy up a big chip manufacturer or buy up a tool and die industry that's very, or a company that's very strategic, the answer would certainly be no.
Right.
So in the WTO, their accession, as far as I know, did not have a reciprocity requirement with regard to investment. However, do you think it would be in the interest of the United States, and it's a debatable topic here, a number of us are looking at legislation to maybe include investment reciprocity as part of the CFIUS process. Do you think that would be wise, or do you think that would undermine the vitality of the United States by restricting investment, even though there's clearly no reciprocity going on right now between the number one and number two economies in the world? And in my view, it's an unlevel playing field. China can do it. They're doing it. If we want to go over and do it, we couldn't. How do we deal with that?
I think reciprocity is an important concept in trade agreements, and I think there are other important concepts as well. To me, another one is simultaneity of concessions. We have tended in prior trade agreements to make our concessions up front, and the other party makes their concessions later. But the problem is that later sometimes doesn't come, because when you have weak enforcement provisions and you've already made your concessions, a little bit hard to unscramble the eggs. So I think reciprocity is an important concept going forward. I think simultaneity is an important concept going forward. I think, as I've mentioned, I think while you were out of the hearing room, the concept of an automatic reexamination after a period of time to find out, well, what worked, what didn't work, and what should we fix. I think there are a number of these conceptual issues that have not been present in prior trade agreements, but I would hope that if confirmed, I can contribute toward designing kind of a model trade agreement where we would introduce into it certain principles that would have to be in any agreement. I think it's a huge mistake to start out each time with kind of a blank page from ground zero. Makes it take longer, makes it harder to negotiate. The best negotiating tool is to be able to tell someone, I can't change this. This is official policy. You know it is. We got it in 10 other deals. We're not going to give you anything different. That's a much better position, in my opinion, than starting out with a blank slate.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, may I have opportunity to answer one, or ask one more question? Thank you. Mr. Ross, I wanted to talk just a little bit on the infrastructure element. I think you're going to see a number of Senate colleagues on both sides of the aisle be supportive of doing more with regard to infrastructure. And as we talked about, one element that I think a number of us see as critical when we move forward on a big, large-scale infrastructure initiative is fixing the federal government's broken permitting system.
Yes.
So whether that's, on average right now, it takes 6 years to permit a bridge in the United States of America. We had a hearing here on airport infrastructure last year. It took the Seattle airport to build a new runway 15 years to get the federal permits. In Alaska, it took Shell 7 years to get the federal government's permission to drill one exploration well in 100 feet of water. It's a broken system. And if we have an infrastructure package that's in the hundreds of billions without a dramatic overhaul of our permitting system, I fear it's going to be money that can't be deployed. Would you agree to work with us on not only focused on the financing of infrastructure, but the very, very important issue of fixing a broken federal permitting system where, you know, this country used to build big things on time, and now we can't permit a bridge inside of a half a decade?
Oh, I know. The permitting is an issue. I think it's one of the reasons why there weren't so many shovel-ready projects when President Obama got money for infrastructure. And the permitting isn't just on big projects. In some parts of this country, if you want to put a porta potty on a well site, you have to go get a permit, and it takes weeks to do that. That's not even drilling a hole in the ground. It's not invasive. It's not anything. I think we've gone a little permit nutsy.
Well, I look forward to working with you on that, and I look forward to your speedy confirmation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Sullivan. All good line of questioning, and I know I have found the answers, responses today on some of the trade issues to be somewhat reassuring. I think there are a lot of folks who are spooked when they hear a rhetoric surrounding 35% tariffs and that sort of thing, and I think you've given good insights into how that would might be interpreted today. Senator Nelson, I think, has a couple of cleanup questions, and we'll probably get you out of here shortly.
Well, you have certainly seen by the questions today and the breadth of the subjects that's covered by the Commerce Committee, the intense interest. You have comported yourself quite well. You have been very detailed and non-evasive in your answers, and that is appreciated. And albeit the length of this hearing, let me assure you that this hearing is a piece of cake compared to some of the other nominees that are going through the process of the constitutionally required advise and consent. Your wife, Hillary, has been most patient back there and has not looked around the room. She has been very attentive, so my compliments to her as well. Just for a couple of cleanup things here, I want to insert in the record, Mr. Chairman, a letter by 10 scientists, many of whom are professors at Florida universities, having to do with the concern of our state being so fragile when it comes to sea level rise. And I would quote just one paragraph in this letter addressed to you. Like you, climate scientists are facing a distressing situation as we study the projected impacts of sea level rise. However, we remain optimistic that our challenges can be solved with American ingenuity, entrepreneurship, strategy, and new technologies.
Without objection, we'll have it included in the record.
That sounds quite a reasonable approach. And here I would also like to insert a document just released this morning at 10:30 from NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information, marking some of the measurements with regard to consecutive years of record warmth on the globe. And I think that's instructive for us to have from NOAA.
Without objection.
Itself. Senator Blumenthal asked what I was going to ask about our support for Israel and your attitude about that, and I think you covered that. And I would finally appeal to you as a Floridian who lives on the coast that there is not only a tourist industry, which is an $85 billion a year industry in Florida, almost 1 million jobs connected with tourism, much of which depends on the very attractive and pristine beaches that we have. And we learned a valuable lesson in the Deepwater Horizon oil spill when that oil, fortunately, did not get to all of our beaches, but instead had gotten to Pensacola Beach, which was covered up, some oil on Destin beaches, as well as tar balls as far east as Panama City. But what it did, it shut down the tourist season for one entire year on the Gulf Coast. And had that spill been at a time when the loop current that comes off of the western end of Cuba and loops up into the Gulf of Mexico, then turns south, goes around the Florida Keys and becomes the Gulf Stream that hugs the coast, not only at Miami, but at your residence in West Palm Beach, all the way up to Fort Pierce before it takes off further out into the Atlantic from the coast. Had that spill or any future spill gotten into the loop current, we would have that effect on the east coast of Florida and the resulting debacle with regard to our tourism industry. Now, there's one other reason of why this is so important to us. And you and I have not had a chance to talk about this. The largest training and testing area for the United States military in the world is the Gulf Coast off of Florida. It is the Gulf Testing and Training Range, and thus the extensive activities at not only Eglin Air Force Base, but also Tyndall Air Force Base at Panama City. I have 2 letters from 2 Republican secretaries of defense saying we simply cannot have oil drilling activities, that it is incompatible with the testing and training of some of our most sophisticated weapons. When you combine that with the fact that the geology shows that there is very little oil off of Florida, the oil is off of Louisiana, where all of the sediments came down the Mississippi.
And Alaska.
I'm talking about the Gulf of Mexico right now. I won't get into the Bering Sea and the North Slope and all of that. I'm tending to Florida. You tend to Alaska. That the effects would be devastating, so much so that my colleague, a Republican former senator, Senator Mel Martinez, joined with me for all of the reasons that I've stated, and we put in law off limits until the year 2022, the Gulf of Mexico off of Florida. That's in law. And so I ask you to consider this because there are going to be others in the cabinet in which you serve that their idea is drill, baby, drill. This senator is not objecting to drilling if it's in the right places. But for all the reasons that I've stated, I felt it incumbent for me to bring it up to you since you are going to be, obviously, by virtue of your testimony today, you're going to be a very, very influential voice in the cabinet, and I hope in the White House. So with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the extent to which mine and Mr. Ross's posteriors have endured almost 4 hours.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. And yeah, this has been a lengthy hearing, but I think a very, as you pointed out, productive one in terms of the responses it's generated and the substance of the discussion. There's been, I think, a wide range of questions posed from members of this committee who represent very different areas of the country, but the range of the issues this committee has jurisdiction over is such that it requires a good amount of knowledge on behalf of our nominee, and we certainly appreciate the way in which he's stepped up to that challenge and responded to our questions today. I have one last question, and then we'll let you get out of here. I think it's the only subject that hasn't been covered today, or at least it hasn't been covered in much, and that is, Mr. Ross, in 2012, FirstNet was established as an independent authority to implement a nationwide broadband network dedicated to first responders. And as FirstNet makes progress, and it has made some progress in acquisition activities, consultation, and internal controls, it still faces a good number of challenges. So I want to emphasize that FirstNet is an independent authority, but I want to ask also whether you will commit to being engaged on the progress of FirstNet and to inform this committee if you observe any waste, fraud, or abuse within that program should you be confirmed.
I certainly support the concept of FirstNet. I gather there is some controversy in some states about it, and I gather there have been some technical issues. I'm obviously not yet conversant with them. But the idea of giving the first responders all the tools that you can imagine that could be useful has to be the right direction to go. So I'm certainly supportive of that. And to the degree there are issues with it, I'll do my best, if confirmed, to try to figure out how to overcome them.
Good. Well, and we look forward to having you bring your expertise in solving problems and managing difficult circumstances to bear on this issue as well. I believe that's it. Given our hope to confirm Mr. Ross as soon as possible, we'll keep the hearing record open until 12:30 p.m. tomorrow. During this time, senators are asked to submit any additional questions for the record, and upon receipt, we would ask our nominee to submit written answers to the committee as soon as possible so that we can get about the process of scheduling you and reporting you out of here and getting you to the floor for a vote. So with that, thank members of the committee. Thank you, Mr. Ross, for your willingness to serve our country, and for those who came with you today, and your wife Hillary for your patience. It's a long hearing, but it's an important one. So with that, this hearing will be adjourned.
Thank you, Senators.
But that hasn't necessarily been consistent with what Republicans generally talk about with trade. I mean, how did you feel about how he talked about things like, redoing trade negotiations on a regular basis and redoing NAFTA right away?
I thought that what he expressed was that he wanted to re-examine trade agreements, including NAFTA, but that he was also, I think, very open, in terms of keeping options on the table. I mean, it seemed to me at least that he has an interest, and I think an interest that's based upon his experiences. You heard him speak to today that there are a lot of companies in this country that are victims of unfair trade practices employed by other countries, and that it's worthwhile on an ongoing basis to relook at some of those trade agreements. So I don't think there's anything he said today that anybody would take much of an issue with, because I think he wants to re-examine, but I think he also said that he was very open about keeping his options open.
Any concerns that they're not going to be as open to free trade as Republicans in Congress would like?
Well, as I pointed out, I have been concerned based on some of the rhetoric that has come out throughout the course of the campaign and from the incoming administration on trade issues. Specifically, the 35% tariff, for example, is one issue. There have been other circumstances or cases, I think, where there have been statements made that, we're very much up here, as you know, been very supportive of trade. A state like mine depends heavily upon it. We're an export-oriented state of agriculture. So, but I thought he did a really good job today of talking about enforcing the law, examining on a recurring basis these trade agreements, maybe see how they're operating, what's working, what's not. But I felt that I was comfortable with the way he addressed those issues today.
Senator, did he provide any reassurance that there would not be massive tariffs on China or Mexico as a result of this administration?
I think that what I got out of it was that, one, when you're negotiating, you want to go in with a good hand. And I think that some of the statements that are made put other countries on notice and alert them to the fact that it's not going to be business as usual. And that, cutting good deals on the front end is important. And then I think he also was very heavy on robust enforcement, which I think people generally would agree with. I think we have been, and there are examples where, as I said, companies and industries in this country have been taken advantage of because other countries haven't abided by the same rules of trade that we follow, and we don't sometimes enforce our trade agreements or enforce our laws.
Mr. Chairman, are you comfortable with Ross's expectation that there would be direct federal spending in any sort of transportation or infrastructure package?
Well, I suspect that would be conditioned by direct federal spending, but offset or paid for in some fashion, I assume. They've talked about three different tiers of one being, where you could get private sector and leverage that. I think he was pretty clear that in some circumstances, including when I asked the question about rural infrastructure projects, that that would be interpreted in a different way. I think that what works in New York may not work in South Dakota, and I think he expressed an openness to taking a look at if they put together an infrastructure package in having some flexibility contained within it, and how those things might be financed in areas of the country where you may not have revenue sources to provide the stream to pay off investors.
Do you read Ross's comments as there will be no tariff on Mexico? You said he shed some light on it, but I don't really know. He was sort of non-committal.
Well, I think he may not have been non-committal in terms of specifically coming out and saying that, he wanted some sort of tariff on Mexico or Canada or anything like that. But I think what he did say was that he was willing to re-examine these agreements. And I think he's been very consistent in that, as has the incoming president, about relooking at some of those agreements.